What if the most powerful beings in the ancient world simply vanished, leaving behind only whispers in clay and ruins that suggest they were never meant to be forgotten? What if the collapse of the world's first great civilization wasn't gradual decay, but something more deliberate, more final, as though an entire cosmic order had been dismantled in a single generation? Beneath the dust of southern Iraq, in temple complexes that once rang with hymns to beings called the Anunnaki, archaeologists have found something unsettling. The final tablets, the last references, names of gods, or leaders, or something else entirely, pressed into clay by hands that seemed to know they were recording an ending. And then, silence. As if someone had closed a door on an entire epoch of human history and locked it from the other side. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and survival, between ancient gods and forgotten rulers. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient mystery stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. The question that has haunted researchers, mystics, and archaeologists alike isn't whether the Anunnaki existed. The tablets prove someone or something held that name. The question is what they were. Ancient Sumerian kings called them judges of fate. Temple records list them as council members who determined human destiny. Myths describe them as beings who descended from the heavens, taught civilization to primitive humans, and ruled with knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced. And then, sometime around the 4th century before the Common Era, every reference to them simply stops. The temples fell silent, the priesthood scattered, and whatever the Anunnaki had been, they left the world of humans forever. Tonight, we're going to trace that ending. We'll walk through the archaeological evidence, separate ancient reality from modern interpretation, and explore what the tablets actually say about these beings and their disappearance. Whether you believe they were gods, ancient astronauts, or something else entirely, one fact remains undeniable. Whoever or whatever the Anunnaki were, something erased them so completely that even their memory nearly died. And the event that caused their civilization to collapse might be the most important historical mystery we've forgotten to solve. The first thing you need to understand is that we have actual definitions. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves told us what the word Anunnaki meant, and their explanation is both simpler and stranger than modern theories suggest. In the earlier Sumerian texts, dating to around 4,800 years ago, the Anunnaki are described as the children of An, the sky god, whose name literally means __0_. They were the council of great gods, typically numbering 7, though some texts list 50 or even 600. But here's where it gets interesting. The Sumerians made a clear distinction between the Anunnaki, who judged the dead and determined fate, and the Agigi, who were described as younger gods performing labour. This hierarchy appears consistently across thousands of tablets, suggesting it wasn't metaphor or mythology, but rather a cosmic organisational chart that ancient scribes treated as factual documentation of a very real structure of power. The word itself carries weight when you break it down linguistically. Anunnaki in Sumerian can be parsed as quote, 1 or quote 2 within referring to heaven and ki referring to earth. They were beings who bridged celestial and terrestrial realms. Neither fully one nor the other, positioned precisely at the intersection, where divine authority met human experience. This linguistic positioning wasn't accidental. Ancient scribes were meticulous about terminology, about classification, about ensuring that every entity in their vast cosmology occupied the correct conceptual space. When they describe the Anunnaki, they use specific grammatical constructions that appear nowhere else in their religious texts, a subtle linguistic signal that these beings occupied a unique category within the divine hierarchy. What makes the ancient definitions so compelling is their consistency across time and geography. Whether you're reading tablets from Ur in the south or Nippur in the north, from the early dynastic period around 4,600 years ago, or the Neo-Babylonian era 2,000 years later, the Anunnaki maintain the same essential characteristics. They judge. They decree fate. They gather in council to make decisions that ripple across the cosmos and down into human affairs. This consistency across millennia suggests the concept wasn't evolving organically the way myths typically do, shifting with each retelling until the original becomes unrecognizable. Instead, it remained stable, preserved, as though ancient scribes were maintaining an accurate record rather than embellishing a story. The number 7 appears with particular insistence when texts describe the Anunnaki's council. 7 judges in the underworld, 7 great gods who determine destiny, 7 torches lit in the darkness. This numerical precision troubled early translators because 7 held profound significance throughout Mesopotamian culture. There were 7 gates to the underworld, 7 demons of disease, 7 planetary bodies visible to the naked eye. Was this numerology? Symbolic thinking that used 7 to represent completeness? Or was it documentation, a specific count of actual council members that became so important to ancient religion that the number 7 itself became sacred in their culture? The question sounds abstract, almost academic, but it cuts to the heart of what we're trying to understand. Were the Mesopotamians describing cosmological principles through personified abstractions? Or were they recording the structure of something they believed had genuine, tangible reality? And here's what keeps researchers returning to these texts despite having answered these questions to their own satisfaction. The Sumerians weren't naive. They were sophisticated thinkers who developed complex mathematics, created detailed legal codes, and built irrigation systems that required precise engineering calculations. These weren't people prone to confusing metaphor with reality or mistaking poetic imagery for factual documentation. When they pressed the names of the Anunnaki into clay, when they built temples to house their presence, when they set aside portions of harvests as offerings to sustain them, they did so with the same practical administrative competence they applied to every other aspect of civilization. Which raises an uncomfortable question that mainstream archaeology addresses by pointing to universal human tendency toward religious belief, but which others have asked more directly. What if the ancient Mesopotamians treated the Anunnaki as real because, within their framework of understanding, within their direct experience, these beings were real? When Samuel Noah Kramer began his life's work translating Sumerian tablets in the 1930s, he wasn't looking for ancient astronauts or lost civilizations ruled by extraterrestrial beings. He was looking for poetry, for the roots of human literature, for the moment when our species first learned to capture thought in written form. What he found was stranger. The Sumerians, he discovered, had an incredibly detailed cosmology, complete with creation myths, divine genealogies, and specific roles assigned to each deity. The Anunnaki appeared in text after text, always described with the same characteristics, the same functions, the same curious mixture of divine power and bureaucratic responsibility. Kramer spent 50 years piecing together their story from thousands of clay fragments, and his conclusion was careful and measured. These were gods, he said, but they were gods who behaved remarkably like administrators, like managers, like beings tasked with specific organizational duties rather than abstract worship. Kramer's approach was revolutionary not because he made extraordinary claims, but because he didn't. In an era when other scholars were still treating Sumerian texts as primitive folklore, he recognized literary sophistication comparable to anything produced in the ancient world. He found humor in their myths, tragedy in their epics, philosophical depth in their religious poetry. The Anunnaki emerged from his translations as complex characters with motivations, conflicts, and personalities distinct from one another. Enki the clever, Enlil the authoritarian, Ninhursag the maternal, each playing specific roles in a cosmic drama that Sumerians followed with the same invested attention modern audiences bring to serialized storytelling. But what troubled Kramer What he mentioned in lectures and footnotes, though never quite explored in his published work, was the tone of the texts. When Sumerian scribes described the Anunnaki's actions, they wrote with a matter-of-factness that seemed different from how other ancient cultures described their gods. Egyptian texts about Ra and Osiris carried mythological grandeur. Greek descriptions of Zeus and Athena embraced epic poetry and symbolic meaning. But Sumerian administrative tablets mentioned the Anunnaki the way modern bureaucrats might reference government departments, matter-of-factly, practically, as though these beings' existence and authority were simply assumed facts requiring no explanation or justification. Kramer documented hundreds of examples, temple records listing offerings presented to the Anunnaki, specifying exact quantities of barley, dates, and oil. Legal texts invoking their authority to enforce contracts, as though they were appellate judges whose rulings carried binding weight. Royal inscriptions describing how kings received their authority directly from Anunnaki council decisions, with specific gods named as supporters and others as opponents. This wasn't the language of religious metaphor. It was the language of political reality, of administrative hierarchy, of bureaucratic organization that happened to include divine beings at the top of the chain of command. Over his 5 decades of translation work, Kramer assembled what remains the most comprehensive academic understanding of Anunnaki mythology. He documented their family relationships, their spheres of influence, their conflicts and alliances. He traced how their stories evolved across centuries, how Akkadian conquest blended with Sumerian tradition, how Babylonian theology reinterpreted older myths. But he also documented the anomalies. Texts that didn't quite fit, references that seemed to describe something beyond typical religious belief, passages where the Anunnaki weren't acting like gods receiving worship, but like administrators managing complex operations, making practical decisions, dealing with consequences of their actions in ways that suggested genuine accountability rather than arbitrary divine whim. His students and colleagues have continued this work, refining translations, discovering new tablets, filling gaps in understanding. The academic consensus Kramer helped establish remained solid. The Anunnaki were deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, comparable to gods in any ancient religion, understood through the lens of myth and religious practice. But Kramer himself, in private conversations near the end of his life, admitted to colleagues that something about the Sumerian descriptions troubled him. Not enough to abandon scholarly rigor or embrace alternative theories. Just enough to keep him wondering whether ancient people had been trying to communicate something that translation alone couldn't fully capture. If you want to understand where the Anunnaki entered human consciousness, you have to travel south through Uruk to a place called Eridu, where the Euphrates once met the sea and the world's first city rose from reed-scattered marshland 7,000 years ago. British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated Eridu in the 1940s and found something that still troubles researchers. Beneath the ruins of later temples, he uncovered layer after layer of older sanctuaries, each built directly atop the previous one, going back and back and back through time. 17 successive temples, each one built with greater sophistication than the last. And at the very bottom, at the foundation level, dating to around 5400 BCE, he found a small shrine with something unexpected. Cuneiform inscriptions naming Enki, chief of the Anunnaki Council, as the temple's patron, which means humans were building elaborate sanctuaries to these beings before they had even invented the wheel, before agriculture had spread beyond the Fertile Crescent at the very dawn of civilization itself. Eridu holds a special place in Mesopotamian consciousness that goes beyond its archaeological significance. According to Sumerian king lists, it was the first city to receive kingship from heaven. According to creation myths, it was where Enki established his temple in the primordial waters, where he created humans from clay, where civilization itself began. The city's name appears in texts as synonymous with origins, with beginnings, with the moment when the cosmic order first touched the earth and left permanent marks. and the physical evidence supports this mythological importance in ways that still generate scholarly debate. Woolley's excavation revealed something unprecedented. Most ancient sites show gradual development, primitive structures slowly gaining complexity as generations learned construction techniques and accumulated resources. Eridu doesn't follow that pattern. Even the earliest temple level shows architectural sophistication that shouldn't exist yet. The builders understood sacred geometry, proportional relationships, and construction methods that other sites wouldn't develop for centuries. The temple walls aligned with cardinal directions with precision that required astronomical observation. The foundation incorporated decorative elements that served no structural purpose, but clearly held symbolic meaning. Someone was already thinking about how to build sacred space in ways that transcended simple shelter from elements. Each successive temple preserved the exact footprint of the previous one, building upward and outward but maintaining the original shrine's orientation and proportions. This continuity across 1500 years suggests more than religious conservatism. It suggests each generation believed they were maintaining something established by the original builders, something too important to alter even slightly. Archaeologists found foundation deposits beneath each temple level, clay cones and ceremonial objects that indicated ritual consecration. Each rebuilding wasn't just construction. It was a renewal of covenant, reaffirmation of a relationship between the city and its divine patron. The inscriptions naming Enki appear at every level, growing more elaborate as cuneiform writing developed, but always carrying the same essential message. This place belongs to the god of waters, the god of wisdom, the chief of the Anunnaki who chose Eridu as his earthly dwelling. And here's what makes it remarkable. As early as 5,000 years ago, priests were already treating Eridu as ancient, already describing Enki's temple as established. Quote 3, already viewing their own time as maintaining traditions handed down from forgotten ages. How far back did memory extend? When did humans first begin worshipping Enki at this spot? The archaeology can only take us to the earliest permanent structures, but Sumerian texts suggest religious activity at Eridu predated even those foundations, stretching back into periods when humans still lived in reed huts and survived by fishing the marshlands. Woolley also found something else beneath Eridu's temples, an 8-foot layer of clean water deposited silt with no human artifacts, separating earlier occupation layers from later construction. Evidence of catastrophic flooding that had inundated the city, killed its inhabitants, and required complete resettlement. He initially dated this flood layer to around 3,500 BCE and suggested it might be the historical basis for the Sumerian flood myths, the real disaster that inspired the story of divine judgment, later echoed in the biblical Noah narrative. This interpretation has been challenged and refined by subsequent researchers, but the basic observation stands. Eridu survived a devastating flood, and when survivors returned, they rebuilt Enki's temple in precisely the same location, maintaining exact continuity with pre-flood tradition. The city's connection to the Anunnaki extended beyond Enki alone. Later temples at Eridu honoured multiple deities, but always with Enki holding primacy, always described as the Anunnaki's leader in this region, always credited with establishing the me, the fundamental principles that made civilized life possible. Thousands of administrative tablets from Eridu's temple archives document offerings, festivals, and rituals spanning centuries. These mundane records provide a window into how ancient Mesopotamians understood their relationship with the Anunnaki. Not as distant abstract forces, but as actively present powers requiring regular maintenance, attention, and propitiation. The temples weren't symbolic structures. They were functioning interfaces between human and divine realms, and Eridu was the prototype, the original temple that established patterns all later sanctuaries would follow. In 1976, a self-taught scholar named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet that would change how millions of people understood ancient history. Sitchin made an extraordinary claim. He argued that the Anunnaki weren't gods at all. but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru who had come to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago to mine gold. According to his translation of Sumerian texts, these aliens genetically engineered Homo sapiens as a slave species, ruled humanity through a hierarchy of commanders and administrators, and eventually departed Earth after a catastrophic event. His interpretation was immediately rejected by every mainstream Assyriologist and Sumerian scholar. They pointed out translation errors, misreadings of cuneiform, and interpretations that ignored context and linguistic rules. But Sitchin's theory spread anyway, compelling and complete, offering a unified explanation for dozens of ancient mysteries. The question we need to ask tonight isn't whether Sitchin was right. The question is why his interpretation felt so much more satisfying than the academic consensus, and what that reveals about the actual mystery buried in those ancient texts. Sitchin's background is important to understanding both his theory's appeal and its fatal flaws. He was born in Azerbaijan, raised in Palestine, educated in economic history at the University of London. He learned Hebrew and studied biblical texts extensively, later teaching himself to read cuneiform by working with published transliterations and dictionaries. This unconventional path gave him freedom from academic constraints, but also meant he lacked the rigorous training professional Assyriologists undergo, training that includes years of studying grammar, context, and literary conventions essential to accurate translation. His approach was fundamentally different from scholars like Kramer. Where Kramer spent decades mastering one language and culture, Sitchin moved rapidly across multiple ancient texts, looking for patterns and connections that fit his emerging theory. The theory itself was comprehensive and internally consistent, which partly explains its enduring popularity. Sitchin argued that the Sumerian term Anunnaki meant those who from heaven to earth came, interpreting this as literal description of space travellers. He claimed their planet, Nibiru, had an elliptical orbit that brought it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, and that the ancient Mesopotamians had sophisticated astronomical knowledge because the Anunnaki had taught them. He reinterpreted creation myths as describing genetic engineering, flood narratives as nuclear warfare, and temple construction as mining operations. Every cuneiform text, every myth, every archaeological discovery became evidence for a single grand narrative of ancient astronauts who created humanity and then left, promising to return. Professional Assyriologists responded with unusual unity and forcefulness. They documented specific translation errors, pointing out where Sitchin had misread signs, ignored grammatical rules, or invented meanings with no linguistic support. They explained that Nibiru in actual Sumerian astronomy referred to various celestial crossings or the planet Jupiter, never to a mysterious 12th planet with the orbit Sitchin described. They noted that his interpretation of the Anunnaki's name was etymologically impossible, that his reading of creation myths ignored literary conventions, that his claims about Sumerian astronomical knowledge were based on texts he'd misunderstood. Scholar after scholar published detailed refutations. Michael Heiser wrote extensively about Sitchin's errors. Ronald Wallenfels addressed the astronomical claims. Every major academic institution teaching Assyriology issued statements clarifying that Sitchin's work had no scholarly merit. But the refutations didn't matter. The 12th Planet became an international bestseller. Sitchin wrote 13 more books expanding his theory. Television shows featured his ideas. Millions of people became convinced that mainstream scholars were either ignorant of the truth or actively suppressing it. This reaction reveals something important about human psychology and our relationship with ancient mysteries. Sitchin's theory offered certainty, where archaeology offered ambiguity. It provided clear answers to profound questions about human origins, purpose, and destiny. It made ancient texts feel relevant to modern concerns about technology, space exploration, and humanity's future. Most importantly, it suggested that we weren't alone, that we'd never been alone, that powerful beings had once cared enough about humanity to intervene directly in our development. The academic consensus, by contrast, offered complexity without resolution. Scholars could explain what the text said, but not why ancient people believed these things. They could document religious practice, but not bridge the gap between ancient worldview and modern understanding. They could prove Sitchin was wrong, but couldn't provide an alternative explanation that felt equally satisfying to people seeking meaning in ancient mysteries. This asymmetry created space for Sitchin's theory to flourish despite its flaws. It addressed emotional and psychological needs that rigorous archaeology couldn't meet, offering a coherent narrative where scholarship offered fragmented evidence and careful qualifications. Let me take you inside a tablet. Not metaphorically, but actually, into the experience of reading cuneiform text pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. The script is dense, geometric, each wedge-shaped mark representing a syllable or a concept. The text before you is part of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and it's describing the moment when the Anunnaki received their assignments. The language is formal, ritualistic, structured like legal documentation. It lists their names, it specifies their duties, it describes how they were divided into groups, some assigned to heaven, some to earth, some to the underworld. And here's what strikes every scholar who works with these texts directly. There's no ambiguity about what category these beings belong to. The Sumerian term Dingir, represented by a star-shaped cuneiform sign, appears before each name. Dingir means God. Not maybe God, not figurative God, but the actual Sumerian word for deity. Every single time the Anunnaki are mentioned, they're marked with this sign, which means ancient scribes classified them clearly, consistently, and without exception as members of the divine realm. The experience of reading cuneiform is fundamentally different from reading alphabetic scripts. Each sign can represent a word, a syllable, or a concept depending on context. The same sign might be read entirely differently based on adjacent marks or understood meaning. This complexity meant scribes required years of training, memorizing hundreds of signs and their various readings, learning not just how to decode individual marks, but how to understand their relationships, their contextual meanings, their layered significance. Cuneiform wasn't simple transcription of speech. It was a sophisticated system for encoding multiple levels of meaning simultaneously. When you examine tablets describing the Anunnaki, this sophistication becomes apparent. The texts use specific grammatical constructions reserved for divine beings. They employ terminology that creates careful distinctions between different classes of gods. They maintain consistent orthographic conventions that signal how readers should understand each reference. Nothing about this is ambiguous or poetic in ways that might suggest metaphorical interpretation. The scribes were documenting what they understood as factual information about divine. Hierarchy, using all the linguistic tools available to them to communicate precisely and unambiguously. Consider the Enuma Elish itself. This 7-tablet epic describes the creation of the world, the establishment of cosmic order, and the organization of divine government. When it reaches the section describing the Anunnaki, the language shifts. It becomes almost administrative, listing each deity's assignment with bureaucratic precision. 300 Anunnaki in heaven, 300 on earth, specific roles, defined responsibilities, clear chain of command. This isn't the language of myth in the sense of symbolic storytelling divorced from reality. It's the language of documentation, as though the scribe was recording actual organizational structure that contemporary readers would recognize and understand. The Dingir sign itself is revealing. In cuneiform, it appears as an 8-pointed star, and its placement before divine names functioned like a grammatical marker indicating the category of being referenced. But the sign also represented heaven, divinity, and sacred power. Its presence marked the text as discussing entities that existed in a different realm, operated according to different rules, and required specific protocols for interaction. Ancient readers seeing Dingir before Anunnaki would understand immediately that these weren't human rulers or historical figures being mythologized. These were beings classified linguistically, grammatically, and theologically as gods. Yet here's what complicates simple dismissal of alternative theories. The same texts that clearly mark the Anunnaki as gods also describe them with remarkable specificity. They have names that can be translated. They have genealogies that can be traced. They engage in recognizable political behavior, forming alliances, competing for influence, making decisions that reflect identifiable motivations. They aren't abstract forces, but individuals with personalities, preferences, and patterns of behavior that remain consistent across multiple texts. This combination of divine classification and individual characterization creates an unusual quality that scholars acknowledge even while maintaining orthodox interpretations. When you read enough cuneiform texts, patterns emerge that aren't visible in translation. The ancient scribes had ways of distinguishing between different types of divine beings, different levels of mythological truth, different modes of discussing cosmic realities. They used one set of conventions for describing ancient creation events, another for contemporary temple rituals, another for theological speculation about divine nature. The Anunnaki appear most frequently in texts using the conventions associated with contemporary reality rather than distant myth. They're discussed the way the texts discuss human kings and priests, with detail and specificity suggesting the authors believe these beings were active participants in the world they inhabited. This doesn't prove alternative theories correct. Professional translators maintain correctly that divine beings can be described with detail and personality while remaining mythological constructs rather than historical entities. Greek myths gave Zeus specific characteristics. Roman legends made Mars a fully realized character. Egyptian texts described Ra's daily journey with geographic precision. None of this required those gods to exist physically. Human imagination is capable of creating elaborate fictional worlds that feel internally real. But it does suggest why non-specialists reading these texts might question whether something more was being documented. The Mesopotamians wrote about the Anunnaki the way historians write about real people, the way administrators document real organizations, the way witnesses describe real events. And that quality, that tone of documentary rather than imaginative literature persists, even in careful scholarly translation, creating a tension between what the texts say they're describing and how modern readers have been taught to understand ancient religious literature. The Anunnaki appear most frequently in Mesopotamian texts as a council of 7 judges, and this numerical precision appears too consistently across too many sources to be coincidental. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki light torches that illuminate the underworld. In the myth of Inanna's descent, they pronounce judgment on the goddess herself. In the Atrahasis epic, which describes a great flood eerily similar to the biblical deluge, the Anunnaki gather to decide humanity's fate after humans become too numerous and noisy for the gods' comfort. But what's fascinating is how these texts describe their decision-making process. It's not arbitrary divine whim. It's structured, formal, almost bureaucratic. They deliberate, they debate, they take votes. One god proposes annihilation, another suggests restraint, and eventually they reach consensus. This has led some researchers to argue that Mesopotamian religion preserved memories of an actual governing council, perhaps human rulers who were later deified, whose administrative structure became the template for how ancient people imagined cosmic government itself. The council structure appears with remarkable consistency across different textual traditions and time periods. Whether you're reading early dynastic inscriptions from around 4,600 years ago or Neo-Babylonian texts from 2,500 years ago, the Anunnaki's organizational pattern remains stable. 7 judges, 7 decision-makers, 7 voices that must reach agreement before action can be taken. This stability is unusual in religious evolution, where divine hierarchies typically shift as political powers change, as cities rise and fall, as different priesthoods compete for authority. Yet the Anunnaki's council structure persists unchanged, suggesting it represented something fundamental to Mesopotamian understanding of cosmic order. What makes their decision-making process so interesting is its procedural nature. The texts describe debates with specific structure. One deity speaks, presenting arguments. Another responds with counter-arguments. Evidence is considered. Consequences are weighed. Eventually, through discussion rather than decree, the council reaches consensus and pronounces judgment. This isn't how gods typically behave in ancient mythology. Zeus doesn't debate with the Olympians before hurling thunderbolts. Ra doesn't take votes before sailing through the underworld. Divine action is usually presented as expression of will, immediate and unquestioned. But the Anunnaki operate differently, bound by process, constrained by collective decision-making, subject to rules that limit even their cosmic authority. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed description of their council in action. The text describes how humanity multiplied across the earth, becoming so numerous and noisy that the gods couldn't sleep. The Anunnaki gathered to discuss the problem. Enlil, described as the executive authority, proposed sending plague to reduce human population. The council deliberated. Some agreed, others expressed concern. They implemented the decision, but Enki subverted it by teaching humans medicine. The council gathered again. Enlil proposed drought. Again deliberation. Again implementation. Again subversion by Enki. Finally Enlil proposed the ultimate solution, a flood to eliminate humanity entirely. The text describes fierce debate. Enki argued for mercy. Enlil insisted on extermination. Other council members took positions between these extremes. Eventually, despite Enki's opposition, the majority agreed to the flood. This narrative raises fascinating questions about divine power and political organization. If the Anunnaki truly were cosmic forces, why would they need to debate and vote? Why couldn't the most powerful simply impose his will? The text suggests constraints, checks and balances, a system where even the highest authority required council approval for major decisions. Some scholars interpret this as sophisticated theological thinking, ancient Mesopotamians working through questions about justice, authority, and the relationship between power and legitimacy. Others see cultural memory of actual governance structures being projected onto the divine realm. Human political experience shaping how ancient people imagined cosmic administration. The number 7 itself carried profound significance throughout Mesopotamian culture, but its association with the Anunnaki predates most other symbolic uses. The 7-day week, the 7 classical planets, the 7 gates to the underworld. All these appear to derive from or relate to the 7 judges who determined fate. This suggests the Anunnaki's council structure was primary, foundational. The pattern from which other sevenfold divisions emerged. Which raises another question. If the number 7 became sacred because of the Anunnaki, what made the Anunnaki 7 in the first place? Was it symbolic from the beginning, or was it documentation of an actual council that happened to have 7 members, whose number then became sacred because of who they were? And then there's the underworld connection. In multiple texts, the Anunnaki serve as judges of the dead, determining the fate of souls in the realm below. They light torches in darkness, pronounce verdicts that cannot be appealed, assign the departed to their eternal stations. This chthonic role seems distinct from their other functions as cosmic administrators and fate determiners for the living. Some scholars suggest 2 different groups of beings became conflated under one name. Others argue the Anunnaki's role as underworld judges was original, with their other functions developing later as theology evolved. But there's a third possibility that fewer researchers mention. What if the underworld wasn't metaphorical, wasn't the land of the dead as later cultures understood it, but rather a physical location, a place beneath the earth where certain beings dwelt and from which they emerged to interact with surface-dwelling humans? If the Anunnaki had a leader in the classical texts, it was Enki, whose temple at Eridu we've already visited in these ruins. Enki appears in myth after myth as the wisest of the gods, the master of me, the fundamental principles of civilization, and the deity who consistently advocated for humanity's survival. In the Atrahasis flood narrative, when other Anunnaki decided to wipe out noisy, overpopulated humanity, Enki secretly warned the human hero Atrahasis, gave him architectural plans for a survival vessel, and subverted the council's decision. In the Enuma Elish, Enki is credited with creating humans from clay mixed with divine blood, fashioning beings who could perform labour the younger gods found burdensome. What makes Enki so interesting isn't just his role as creator and protector, it's how the texts describe his character. He's clever, sometimes deceptive, willing to bend rules and challenge authority. He doesn't act like an abstract cosmic force. He acts like a political figure navigating complex alliances, like someone with specific interests to protect, like a leader who understood that power meant nothing without compassion. The me that Enki controlled deserves special attention because they represent something unusual in ancient theology. These weren't moral principles or abstract concepts. According to Sumerian texts, the me were concrete elements of civilization that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. There were over 100 individual me, including kingship, priesthood, sexual intercourse, music, metalworking, writing, law, and warfare. Each me represented both the concept and the ability to practice it. Enki kept them in his temple at Eridu, stored in a place called the Abzu, often translated as the cosmic freshwater ocean, but described in texts as a physical location beneath his temple. The most famous story involving the me describes how Inanna, goddess of love and war, visited Enki and got him drunk. In his inebriated state, Enki gave her the me, which she loaded onto her boat and transported to her own city of Uruk. When Enki sobered and realized what he'd done, he sent servants to retrieve them, but Inanna had already escaped. This myth is usually read as explaining how civilization spread from Eridu to other cities, but notice what it reveals about the me. They behaved like physical objects, they could be moved, they had location, they required conscious bestowal, or could be acquired through trickery. This concreteness appears throughout Enki myths, suggesting ancient Mesopotamians understood the me as real things, not symbolic representations. Enki's role as humanity's protector created ongoing tension with other Anunnaki, particularly Enlil. Where Enlil represented authority, order, and enforcement of cosmic rules, Enki represented wisdom, flexibility, and willingness to subvert those rules when compassion demanded it. Their conflict appears in multiple myths, always following the same pattern. Enlil decides humans deserve punishment. Enki finds ways to help them survive. Enlil discovers the deception and grows angry. Yet Enki never faces permanent consequences for his subversions, suggesting his position within the Anunnaki hierarchy was secure enough to withstand repeated challenges to Enlil's authority. This dynamic has led some researchers to interpret the Anunnaki texts as preserving memory of actual political conflicts between competing authorities. Perhaps Enki and Enlil represented different cities, different royal lineages, or different administrative philosophies that ancient Mesopotamians remembered through theological narrative. The texts themselves encourage such interpretation by describing divine conflicts in recognizably political terms. Enki doesn't oppose Enlil through cosmic battle. He uses cleverness, indirect methods, plausible deniability. He operates the way a subordinate administrator might who disagrees with superior authority, but can't directly challenge it. He finds loopholes, exploits ambiguities, maintains technical obedience while subverting actual intent. The creation of humanity in the Enuma Elish highlights Enki's complex character. The younger gods, the Igigi, had been performing difficult labour and complained about their burden. The Anunnaki Council needed a solution. Enki proposed creating a new being to take over the work, fashioning humans from clay mixed with divine blood. But whose blood? The text specifies that a rebellious god was sacrificed, his blood mixed into the clay to give humans intelligence and vitality. This wasn't arbitrary selection. The sacrifice was deliberate, choosing a deity who had challenged authority, ensuring that human nature would contain elements of both divine intelligence and rebellious spirit. Enki's method of creation is described with unusual specificity. He called upon the mother goddess Nintu to help. Together they fashioned 14 pieces of clay, 7 male and 7 female. Nintu pinched off the clay, and Enki pronounced incantations that gave the figures life. The text describes this as requiring both physical craft and spoken knowledge, both manual skill and verbal power. Humans weren't spoken into existence through pure divine will. They were manufactured through process that combined materials, craftsmanship, and specialized knowledge. This has led some interpreters to read the creation narrative as describing something more technological than magical, though mainstream scholars maintain it's simply ancient people, describing divine power through metaphors of skilled labor they understood from daily experience. What's undeniable is that Enki's relationship with humanity was fundamentally different from other Anunnaki. He created humans not as slaves to be despised, but as beings worthy of knowledge and survival. When the flood came, he didn't just help Atrahasis survive out of caprice. The text suggests he felt genuine attachment, even responsibility for the beings he'd created. This emotional dimension appears throughout Enki myths. He's not distant and terrible. He's engaged, invested, concerned about outcomes in ways that suggest personal stake in human welfare. Whether you interpret him as mythological deity or cultural memory of an actual leader, the character that emerges is consistent, complex, and surprisingly human in his mixture of wisdom and willingness to bend rules for causes he believed just. Before we can understand the end of the Anunnaki, we need to understand the structure beneath them. According to multiple Mesopotamian sources, including the Atrahasis epic and various temple hymns, the Anunnaki were served by a class of younger, lesser deities called the Igigi. These beings were assigned difficult labor, described variously as digging canals, mining operations, and heavy agricultural work. And then, according to the myth, the Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools. They marched to Enki's temple. They demanded relief from their burden. This rebellion is described in remarkable detail, with specific grievances listed, negotiations recorded, and solutions debated. The ultimate resolution was the creation of humans to take over the labor the Igigi had refused. Now. Mainstream scholars read this as mythology explaining class structure or the development of agriculture. But others have asked a different question. What if this myth preserved memory of an actual labor revolt, of workers overthrowing an administrative class, of a power structure collapsing because those at the bottom refused to continue supporting those at the top? The Atrahasis epic devotes significant text to describing the Igigi's working conditions before the rebellion. They labored for 3,600 years, digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, creating irrigation canals, performing the heavy work of establishing civilization's infrastructure. The text doesn't present this as dignified labor. It describes exhaustion, suffering, growing resentment. The Igigi counted the years, measured their burden, watched the Anunnaki enjoy leisure while they toiled. This wasn't cosmic metaphor. It was recognizable exploitation, the exact dynamic that drives labor movements throughout human history. The rebellion itself unfolded with striking specificity. The Igigi gathered at night. They agreed on their course of action. They burned their tools in a dramatic gesture of refusal. Then they marched together to confront Enki, their creator, demanding relief. The text describes their collective action, using language that emphasizes unity, solidarity, shared purpose. They didn't petition individually. They acted as organized labor, understanding that collective withdrawal of work gave them leverage even against beings more powerful than themselves. Enlil's response is telling. He didn't immediately crush the rebellion through divine power. He was frightened. The text explicitly describes his fear, his consultation with other Anunnaki about how to respond. Enki was summoned. The council convened. They discussed the Agigi's grievances and acknowledged they were legitimate. The work had been too hard. The burden had been too great. Something needed to change. This admission that the Agigi had valid complaints, that their rebellion was justified, is remarkable. Divine beings admitting error, acknowledging exploitation, seeking negotiated solution rather than violent suppression. None of this fits typical patterns of how ancient myths describe god-mortal or god-god conflicts. The solution was Enki's creation of humanity, but notice what this meant for power dynamics. The Agigi's rebellion succeeded. They refused to continue their labour and won relief from it. Humans were created specifically to take over work the Agigi had rejected, meaning the exploitation didn't end. It was simply transferred to a new underclass. This darker reading of human creation suggests we were designed from the beginning as substitute labour, our purpose defined by the needs of beings who created us not out of love, but out of necessity when their previous workforce rebelled. Some scholars, particularly those influenced by Marxist analysis, read the Agigi rebellion as cultural memory of actual class conflict in early Mesopotamian society. Perhaps ancient agricultural workers revolted against temple and palace authorities who controlled irrigation systems and demanded labour. Perhaps the myth preserved memory of this conflict, transforming historical struggle into theological narrative. The Anunnaki represented ruling class, the Agigi represented free workers, and humans represented the enslaved populations who replaced free labour after rebellion threatened the economic system. But there's another interpretation that deserves consideration even if it ventures beyond mainstream consensus. What if the rebellion wasn't metaphorical, but described actual events involving real hierarchies of beings? What if the Agigi were actual labourers serving actual administrators, and their revolt succeeded in restructuring their civilization's workforce? This reading requires accepting that the Anunnaki and Agigi were more than mythological constructs, but it has the advantage of taking the text at face value. Reading it as the documentation it presents itself as rather than symbolic story requiring interpretation through modern theoretical frameworks. The fate of the Agigi after human creation is mysterious. They largely disappear from Mesopotamian texts after the Atrahasis epic, mentioned occasionally but no longer playing active roles. Some scholars suggest they were absorbed into other divine categories as theology evolved. Others note that their absence might be significant. Perhaps they departed after their rebellion succeeded, no longer needed once humans took over their labour. The texts don't explain where they went or what became of them. They simply fade from record, leaving only the story of their revolt and the changed world that resulted from it. When you move from mythology to material culture, the story becomes more complicated. Archaeologists working in Iraq, Syria and Iran have uncovered thousands of cylinder seals, temple reliefs, and sculptural representations of the Anunnaki. These depictions are remarkably consistent. The beings are shown as taller than humans, often wearing horned crowns that signify divinity, sometimes surrounded by star symbols, frequently holding objects that researchers have interpreted as tools, weapons, or symbols of authority. At Nippur, excavations revealed a temple complex where the Anunnaki were worshipped through elaborate rituals recorded in administrative tablets. These records are mundane, almost boring. They list offerings, pre-schedules, maintenance tasks. They treat the Anunnaki's presence as factual, routine, bureaucratic. No one writing these tablets seemed to question whether these beings existed. They were documenting real religious practice, and that practice was directed toward entities the ancient Mesopotamians clearly believed were present, active, and responsive. The cylinder seals are particularly revealing because they were personal objects, carried and used by individuals in daily life. They served as signatures, pressed into clay to mark ownership or authorize transactions. Thousands have survived, and a significant percentage depict scenes involving the Anunnaki or other divine beings. These aren't formal religious art commissioned by temples. They're personal expressions of belief, objects people carried because they wanted divine imagery present in their daily lives. The consistency of these depictions across centuries and regions suggests shared visual vocabulary for representing these beings, conventions that everyone understood and followed. The horned crown appears in nearly every depiction. A multi-tiered headdress with horns projecting upward. The number of horn pairs indicated rank within divine hierarchy. Lesser gods wore single-horned crowns. Greater gods like Enki wore crowns with multiple horn pairs. This wasn't decorative symbolism but functional insignia, visual communication of status that would be immediately recognizable to anyone viewing the image. Modern scholars interpret horned crowns as symbolic of divine power, drawing connections to bull worship and associations between horns and strength. But the ancient Mesopotamians themselves left no explanation of why divinity was marked this way. It was simply understood convention, so universal it required no justification. The being's height in artistic depictions raises interesting questions. In cylinder seals and relief carvings, divine figures are consistently shown as significantly taller than humans, often 50% larger or more. Standard art historical interpretation treats this as symbolic representation of greater importance, a convention where size indicates status rather than actual physical dimension. But notice that this convention appears specific to divine beings. Human kings and priests are shown at normal human scale. Only gods and the Anunnaki are depicted as giants. If it was purely symbolic, why wouldn't kings also be shown larger than commoners? The selective application suggests ancient artists might have been depicting something they believed was actual difference, rather than abstract status. The objects held by Anunnaki figures in cylinder seals have generated extensive debate. Some clearly represent recognizable items, plants, vessels, weapons. Others are ambiguous, looking like nothing familiar from ordinary Mesopotamian life. Scholars have proposed various interpretations. They're ritual objects whose purpose we don't understand. They're symbolic representations of divine attributes. They're artistic conventions meaning something to ancient viewers that's opaque to us. But alternative researchers have suggested these objects might be tools or instruments, possibly technological devices that ancient artists rendered as accurately as their skill allowed. Mainstream archaeology rejects this interpretation, noting that applying modern technological assumptions to ancient religious art is methodologically problematic. Yet the question lingers. Why did ancient artists repeatedly depict these beings holding unidentifiable objects, if not because they believed these beings possess things unlike anything in ordinary human experience? The Nippur temple complex provides our most detailed archaeological evidence for Anunnaki worship. Excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania from 1889 through 1990 revealed a massive religious centre that functioned continuously for over 2,000 years. The temple's administrative archives contained over 50,000 tablets, documenting every aspect of religious operation. These weren't theological texts. They were accounting records, the mundane bureaucracy of maintaining an active temple. They list daily offerings brought to the Anunnaki, specific quantities of barley, dates, oil, meat, beer. They record priest assignments, maintenance schedules, festival preparations. They document temple property, agricultural lands worked by temple labourers, craft workshops producing objects for ritual use. What strikes researchers reading these tablets is their matter-of-fact tone. The scribes weren't expressing religious devotion or theological speculation. They were doing paperwork, tracking resources, managing operations. The tablets treat the Anunnaki the way modern administrative documents might reference government agencies, as entities that exist, require regular maintenance, and whose needs must be documented and met. This bureaucratic treatment of divine beings is unusual. Most ancient religious texts emphasize mystery, devotion, or theological interpretation. But Nippur's archives are aggressively practical, suggesting that whatever the Anunnaki represented to ancient Mesopotamians, they were integrated into daily life at the most mundane levels of social organization. Other archaeological sites show similar patterns. At Leonard Woolley excavated temples with foundation deposits invoking Anunnaki protection. At Uruk, German archaeologists found administrative texts referencing Anunnaki oversight of city governance. At Lagash, French excavations revealed cylinder seals depicting rulers receiving authority from Anunnaki figures. The consistency across sites separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of time indicates this wasn't local cult belief but central element of Mesopotamian civilization. The Anunnaki weren't obscure gods worshipped by small groups. They were fundamental to how ancient Mesopotamians understood power, authority, and the organization of society itself. Perhaps no single document has generated more speculation than the Sumerian king list, a cuneiform text compiled around 4,000 years ago that claims to document every ruler of Mesopotamia back to the moment, quote, 5. The list begins with an extraordinary claim. Before the flood, it says, "Kings reigned for impossible durations. The first ruler held power for 43,200 years, the second for 36,000, 8 kings total, ruling for a combined 241,000 years. Then came the flood, and afterward, reign lengths dropped dramatically to centuries, then decades, then normal human lifespans." Mainstream scholars interpret this as mythology blending with history. The impossible reigns representing legendary prehistory before reliable records began. But others have asked why the compilers of this list felt compelled to maintain continuity across the flood, treating pre-Diluvian rulers as part of the same unbroken succession as historical kings whose existence we can verify. Were these early, quote, 6 the Anunnaki themselves, ruling directly before delegating authority to human administrators? The king list exists in multiple versions, compiled at different times and places, but all versions maintain the same basic structure. They begin with the formula, quote, 7, then list antediluvian rulers with impossible reign lengths, then mark the flood as a break point. Then continue with post-Diluvian rulers whose reign lengths gradually normalize until reaching historical figures we can verify through archaeological evidence. This structure has troubled historians since the first translations appeared in the early 20th century. Why maintain continuity across a catastrophic break? Why treat mythical pre-flood rulers and historical post-flood kings as part of the same succession? The individual reign lengths are remarkably specific. The first king of Eridu, Alolim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alaljar, ruled for 36,000 years. Bad Tabira's first king, Enmenlu-Ana, ruled for 43,200 years. These aren't round numbers or obvious symbolic constructions. They're precise figures that suggest calculation rather than invention. Some researchers have proposed these might be astronomical calculations, recording cycles visible to ancient skywatchers and attributed to kingly reigns. Others suggest they might represent dynasties rather than individuals, cumulative years of ruling families compressed into single names. But neither explanation accounts for the preservation of specific numbers across multiple manuscript traditions. The flood serves as the list's central pivot point. Before it, everything is legendary, impossible, beyond normal human experience. After it, the world becomes recognizable. The first post-Diluvian dynasty ruled at Kish, and while their reign lengths are still exaggerated, 1,560 years for one king, 900 years for another, they're no longer cosmic. They've dropped from geological timescales to merely improbable human lifespans. Then, over successive dynasties, reign lengths continue falling, 500 years, 300 years, 100 years, eventually reaching figures that match other historical records. proving these later portions of the list describe real people who actually ruled Mesopotamian cities. This gradual normalization has led many scholars to argue the king list represents cultural memory of actual historical transition. Perhaps the flood narrative marks the boundary between pre-literate societies, whose leaders were mythologized beyond recognition, and literate societies that kept accurate records. Perhaps the impossible reign lengths reflect different ways of calculating time in pre-literate cultures. Perhaps they represent totemic or ritual measurements rather than linear chronology. These explanations make methodological sense and avoid requiring belief in supernatural events or impossible rulers, but they don't explain why the list compilers treated this transition as continuous rather than broken. If the antediluvian rulers were purely mythical while post-diluvian rulers were historical, why not mark that distinction clearly? Why maintain the fiction of unbroken succession? The most straightforward reading of the text suggests its creators believed the early kings were real, that their impossibly long reigns reflected actual events under conditions different from later human experience, and that kingship itself had genuinely continuous history extending back to the moment it underscore, quote, underscore 8, underscore, that phrase deserves careful attention. Quote 9 appears at the beginning of every version of the king list. It's not metaphorical language about divine appointment. The Sumerian is more literal, describing kingship as thing that came down, that moved from one place to another, that had location before it arrived on Earth. Combined with the list's immediate transition to naming specific kings with specific cities and specific reign lengths, the implication is that the compilers believed kingship arrived as tangible institution, brought or granted by beings from heaven, who then appointed or perhaps became the first rulers. Could the antediluvian kings be Anunnaki themselves? The list doesn't explicitly state this, but connections are suggestive. The cities where these early kings ruled, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, were all major centers of Anunnaki worship. Eridu was Enki's city. Sippar belonged to Utu, the sun god. These weren't random settlements, but precisely the locations where ancient texts describe the Anunnaki establishing their primary temples and administrative centers. If divine beings ruled these cities before the flood, either directly or through chosen human representatives, it would explain both the impossibly long reign lengths and the list's insistence on maintaining continuity. The Anunnaki didn't just influence early Mesopotamian civilization. According to this reading, they founded it, ruled it directly, and only gradually withdrew as human capacity for self-governance developed. The flood appears in Mesopotamian sources long before the biblical version, and geological evidence suggests these weren't just myths. Excavations at Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak have revealed distinct layers of water-deposited sediment dating to around 5,000 years ago. Evidence of catastrophic flooding that temporarily disrupted human habitation across southern Mesopotamia. But here's what's interesting. The ancient texts describing this flood don't treat it as a random natural disaster. They describe it as a deliberate act, a decision made by the Anunnaki Council to reduce human population. The flood mythology includes specific details: the construction of a sealed vessel, the survival of select humans and animals, the remorse of certain gods who regretted the destruction. When the waters receded, according to the Atrahasis epic, the surviving Anunnaki wept at seeing the devastation they'd caused. This mixing of natural disaster with divine decision-making has led some researchers to argue that the flood myths preserve cultural memory of an actual catastrophe, interpreted through the religious framework available to ancient survivors trying to make sense of near extinction. Leonard Woolley discovered the first archaeological evidence for the flood during his excavations at in the 1920s. His team was digging through occupation layers when they suddenly hit clean clay, water-deposited sediment with no pottery shards, no ash, no signs of human activity. This layer extended for 8 feet vertically before older occupation debris resumed below. Woolley immediately recognized what he was seeing: a flood so massive it had buried an entire city, interrupting human habitation completely before survivors eventually returned and rebuilt. He dated the layer to approximately 3000 BCE and announced he'd found evidence for the biblical flood. The press coverage was international. Woolley had seemingly proven that the Noah story was based on real events. But as excavations continued at other Mesopotamian sites, the picture became more complicated. Archaeologists found flood layers at multiple locations, but they weren't all from the same time period. Ur's flood dated to around 3000 BCE. Shurupuk's flood layer dated to around 2900 BCE. Kish showed evidence of flooding around 3100 BCE. These weren't the same flood, but rather multiple catastrophic flooding events spread across centuries. Southern Mesopotamia, built on the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, experienced periodic devastation when seasonal floods overwhelmed levees or storms pushed seawater inland. The archaeological evidence suggested not one universal deluge, but repeated local catastrophes that collectively created cultural memory of civilization-threatening floods. Yet the Mesopotamian texts describe a single flood, a specific event that destroyed the antediluvian world and required humanity to restart civilization. The Sumerian king list marks it as the dividing line between the age when kings ruled for thousands of years and the age when reign lengths became recognizably human. The Atrahasis epic describes it as a deliberate decision by the Anunnaki Council, implemented despite internal dissent, carried out with specific intention to reduce human population. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes an entire tablet where the flood survivor Utnapishtim describes the deluge in detail: the construction of his vessel, the loading of animals and craftsmen, the storm that terrified even the gods, the grounding on a mountain, the release of birds to find dry land. These details are too specific, too consistent across multiple independent texts, to be purely imaginative literature. Something happened. Some event or series of events traumatized Mesopotamian civilization deeply enough that flood narrative became central to their understanding of history. The question isn't whether there was a flood, but rather how to reconcile geological evidence of multiple local floods with textual evidence of a singular catastrophic event that ancient people believed had nearly ended human existence. One possibility is that texts preserved memory of the worst flood, the one that caused the most widespread destruction, transforming it into the archetypal deluge that came to represent all floods. Another possibility is that multiple flood experiences were compressed into single narrative through the inevitable simplification that occurs as oral tradition becomes written record. But there's a third possibility that's harder to dismiss entirely. What if the ancient texts were describing something beyond normal flooding? The Atrahasis epic specifies that the flood was preceded by years of drought and famine. Deliberate attempts by the Anunnaki to reduce human population that Enki repeatedly subverted. When those methods failed, they implemented the ultimate solution. The text describes the flood's intensity as supernatural, storms so violent they frightened the gods themselves, waters that covered even the mountains. If you read the flood narratives as purely mythological, these elements are simply dramatic exaggeration. But if you read them as attempts to document actual events, they suggest something more severe than seasonal river flooding. Some researchers have proposed that the flood memories might preserve cultural trauma from the end of the last ice age, when rapidly melting glaciers raised sea levels by hundreds of feet, inundating coastal regions and forcing mass migrations. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow sea, was once a river valley where humans likely lived before rapid flooding drowned the entire region around 7,000 years ago. Could Sumerian civilization, founded by refugees from that disaster, have preserved stories of the drowning of their ancestral homeland? What makes the flood narrative particularly significant for understanding the Anunnaki is the emotional response attributed to them. The Atrahasis epic describes how, when the flood began, even the Anunnaki were frightened by its violence. When it ended and they saw the devastation, They wept. Inanna wailed like a woman in childbirth. The gods sat stunned at the destruction they'd caused. This isn't how divine beings typically behave in ancient mythology. Gods are usually portrayed as distant from human suffering, unmoved by consequences of their actions. But the Anunnaki's response suggests regret, horror, recognition that they'd made a terrible mistake. This emotional investment in human survival, this capacity for remorse, appears throughout Mesopotamian texts in ways that make these beings seem less like abstract cosmic forces and more like individuals capable of genuine relationship with humanity. As we move forward through time, approaching the era when references to the Anunnaki begin to change, we need to understand the political transformation happening across Mesopotamia. Around 4,300 years ago, Semitic-speaking Akkadians began dominating previously Sumerian city-states. The result was linguistic, religious and political fusion. Sumerian gods were reinterpreted through Akkadian theology. Temples were renovated or rebuilt. The Anunnaki remained in the pantheon, but their role began shifting. In earlier Sumerian texts, they were primary deities with active, specific functions. In later Babylonian mythology, they became more abstract, more distant, increasingly described as background figures judging the dead rather than actively governing the living. This transition has sparked debate among scholars. Was this simply religious evolution as cultures blended? Or does it reflect something more concrete? The withdrawal of actual leaders, the end of direct governance, the moment when whoever or whatever the Anunnaki represented stopped actively engaging with human civilization. The Akkadian conquest wasn't a single military campaign, but a gradual demographic and political shift spanning centuries. Semitic-speaking peoples had lived alongside Sumerians for generations, trading, intermarrying, sharing cultural practices. But around 2300 BCE, Akkadian political power consolidated under Sargon of Akkad, who created history's first multi-city empire. Sargon's inscriptions describe him as conquering Sumerian cities one by one, bringing them under unified rule and imposing Akkadian as the administrative language while allowing Sumerian to continue in religious contexts. This linguistic shift had profound implications for religious continuity. Sumerian was a language isolate, unrelated to any other known tongue, with grammar and vocabulary unique to Mesopotamia. When it ceased being a spoken language and survived only in temple rituals, understanding of original religious texts became increasingly dependent on priestly interpretation. The Akkadians translated major myths and epics into their own language. But translation always involves transformation. Concepts that were clear in Sumerian became ambiguous in Akkadian. Wordplay and double meanings were lost. Theological nuances shifted as Akkadian vocabulary imposed different conceptual frameworks. The Anunnaki appeared in Akkadian texts but with changing emphasis. Early Sumerian sources described them as active participants in cosmic and earthly affairs, making decisions, taking actions, engaging directly with humans and other gods. Later, Akkadian and Babylonian texts increasingly portrayed them as passive judges in the underworld, still important but remote. Their day-to-day influence on the living world diminished. This shift could represent natural religious evolution as theology adapted to changing cultural contexts. Different peoples emphasized different aspects of inherited traditions. And Akkadian religious priorities may have focused more on gods like Marduk while backgrounding the Anunnaki Council. But there's another interpretation that some researchers find compelling, even if it ventures into speculation. What if the textual shift from active to passive Anunnaki reflected actual withdrawal of presence? What if these beings, whatever they were, had been actively engaged with early Sumerian civilization, but began disengaging as Akkadian political dominance replaced Sumerian cultural patterns? The text could be documenting real change in relationship between divine and human realms, with later writers describing the Anunnaki as distant judges because they'd become distant, because whatever direct interaction had characterized earlier periods had ended or diminished. The religious fusion that created Babylonian theology shows this transition clearly. In the Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic composed during the Old Babylonian period around 3,700 years ago, Marduk becomes supreme deity by defeating Tiamat and creating the world from her corpse. The Anunnaki appear in this text but in supporting roles, ratifying Marduk's authority rather than wielding it themselves. This represented deliberate theological reorganization, elevating Babylon's patron god above the older Sumerian pantheon. But notice what the text preserved even while reinterpreting it. The Anunnaki still existed as a council. They still determined fates. They still occupied a specific position in cosmic hierarchy. The text didn't eliminate them. It repositioned them, subordinating them to Marduk while maintaining their essential functions. Babylon itself became the new religious center, replacing Sumerian cities in political importance, though not erasing their religious significance. The city's very name, Babili, meant Gate of the Gods, suggesting it was understood as liminal space where divine and earthly realms connected. Babylon's ziggurat, the famous Tower of Babel, was described as a stairway to heaven, physical architecture enabling gods to descend and humans to approach divine presence. Yet even as Babylon rose to dominance, texts continued referencing Eridu as the original holy city, Nippur as the traditional seat of Enlil's authority, acknowledging that religious legitimacy flowed from continuity with Sumerian foundations even as political power relocated. The gradual abstraction of the Anunnaki in Babylonian texts might also reflect changing human capacity for direct divine encounter. Early Mesopotamian religions seem to assume relatively direct communication between humans and gods through dreams, omens, and temple rituals. Priests spoke with divine voices. Kings received direct instructions. The boundary between divine and human realms appeared permeable. But as civilization became more complex, as administrative structures grew more elaborate, as populations increased and cities expanded, the immediacy of divine presence seems to have diminished. The gods didn't disappear from belief, but they became more distant, more abstract, more approached through elaborate ritual and priestly mediation rather than direct encounter. Whether this reflects changing human psychology, evolving religious sophistication, or actual withdrawal of presence depends on how you interpret the relationship between belief and reality. Mainstream scholarship treats it as natural religious development. Gods becoming more abstract as theology becomes more philosophical. But those willing to consider alternative possibilities might ask whether distance itself was real, whether the Anunnaki's changing role in texts documented actual change in their engagement with human civilization, whether the shift from active to passive reflected genuine withdrawal that Babylonian priests were honestly recording, even if they couldn't fully explain it. One reason ancient astronaut theories gained traction is the undeniable sophistication of early Mesopotamian knowledge. The Sumerians had advanced mathematics, including a base 60 counting system we still use for time and angles. They practiced astronomy precise enough to predict lunar eclipses. They created sophisticated irrigation systems, monumental architecture, and bronze metallurgy. All of this appeared seemingly fully formed around 5,000 years ago. Traditional archaeology explains this as the culmination of thousands of years of human experimentation and development, with earlier evidence simply not preserved or not yet discovered. But questions linger. Why did certain advanced knowledge appear first in Mesopotamia rather than other ancient centers? Why do the Sumerians themselves attribute their learning to divine beings who quote 11? And why were they so specific about which god taught which skill? Enki for water management, Inanna for warfare, Niseba for writing, as though documenting actual instruction from identifiable teachers rather than abstract inspiration from cosmic forces. The Sumerian mathematical system is particularly remarkable. Their base 60 counting, developed by at least 3000 BCE, allowed complex calculations that base 10 systems struggle with. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it ideal for practical mathematics involving fractions and measurements. This wasn't accident. Someone chose 60 deliberately for its mathematical elegance. Modern scholars assume this emerged from combining two earlier counting systems, one base 6 and one base 10, but no archaeological evidence documents such earlier systems. The base 60 system appears already established in the earliest mathematical tablets, as though it sprang into existence fully formed with no development period. Their astronomical knowledge was equally sophisticated. The Sumerians identified and named the constellations of the zodiac, tracked planetary movements, calculated the length of lunar months with precision that wouldn't be improved for thousands of years. They knew that planetary bodies moved against fixed stars, that eclipses followed predictable patterns, that celestial mechanics operated according to regular principles. Achieving this knowledge required centuries of careful observation, systematic record-keeping, and mathematical analysis. Yet the earliest Sumerian astronomical texts already demonstrate this sophistication, with no surviving records showing the gradual accumulation of knowledge that such achievements should require. The Muel.apin tablets, Babylonian compilations of older Sumerian astronomical knowledge, list constellations, describe stellar rising and setting times, and provide mathematical formulas for calculating celestial positions. These tablets were created around 3,000 years ago, but documented knowledge clearly much older. The precision of their calculations suggests observations spanning many generations, yet no earlier tablets survive showing the development of this knowledge. It's as though the Sumerians began astronomical observation already knowing what to look for, already possessing mathematical tools adequate to the task, already understanding that careful tracking of celestial movements yielded useful knowledge about seasons, agriculture, and navigation. But it's the Sumerian claims about knowledge origin that most intrigue alternative researchers. The texts are explicit. Writing was taught by Nisaba, goddess of grain and scribes. Mathematics came from Enki, god of wisdom. Agricultural knowledge was given by Ninurta, god of farming and warfare. The fundamental principles of civilization, were kept by Enki in his temple at Eridu until Inanna acquired them through trickery. Every major cultural achievement was attributed to specific divine instruction, rather than human invention. Mainstream scholars interpret these attributions as theological explanations for human achievements, ancient people crediting gods for developments they themselves had accomplished. But the specificity is unusual. Why assign each skill to a particular deity rather than generalizing all knowledge as divine gift? Why describe the me as transferable objects rather than abstract principles? Why frame the acquisition of civilization as instruction from teachers rather than inspiration from abstract forces? Consider irrigation technology. Mesopotamian canal systems were engineering marvels requiring sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, surveying, and construction techniques. The earliest irrigation works already demonstrate this sophistication, with minimal evidence of experimental failure or gradual development. Texts credit Enki with teaching water management, describing him as Lord of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, master of springs and rivers. His cult centers were located precisely at sites where sophisticated hydraulic engineering was most developed. Coincidence? Or documentation that whoever Enki represented, whether god, leader, or something else, was specifically associated with water management expertise? Bronze metallurgy presents similar mysteries. Creating bronze requires not just discovering that copper and tin produce a superior metal when combined, but understanding precise ratios, controlling furnace temperatures, developing casting techniques, and organizing trade networks to acquire tin from distant sources. This complex knowledge appears in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, with minimal archaeological evidence of experimental development. Texts attribute metalworking knowledge to various gods, describing divine instruction in crafts rather than human trial and error. Again, mainstream archaeology assumes gradual development with evidence not yet discovered, but the possibility remains that ancient attributions preserved actual memory, that certain individuals or groups possessed advanced knowledge and shared it with populations who then credited their teachers with divine status, creating mythologies that encoded actual transmission of expertise. The question isn't whether humans are capable of developing sophisticated knowledge independently. Obviously they are. The question is whether Mesopotamian achievements show patterns suggesting external instruction, whether the Sumerians' own explanations of knowledge origin deserve consideration as potential documentation rather than automatic dismissal as mythology, and whether the specific association of particular gods with particular skills might preserve memory of actual teachers whose identities were later mythologized, but whose instruction was historically real. To understand the Anunnaki's influence on Mesopotamian civilization, you have to understand the temple economy. These weren't just religious structures. They were administrative centers, banks, storage facilities, and political headquarters. The Temple of Enki at Eridu, the Temple of Inanna at Uruk, the Temple of Enlil at Nippur, each employed hundreds of workers, owned vast agricultural lands, collected taxes, and controlled the distribution of resources. Thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from these temples are accounting records. They list barley distributed, copper received, labourers assigned, craftsmen paid. Everything flowed through the temples, and the temples claimed to operate on behalf of the gods. This means the Anunnaki, whether gods or something else, weren't abstract religious concepts. They were the theoretical owners of Mesopotamia's economy, the justification for the entire administrative system, the foundation of political legitimacy. When we talk about their disappearance, we're not just talking about religious belief fading. We're talking about the collapse of an entire economic and political structure, built on the premise that these beings existed and their earthly representatives spoke with their authority. The temple archives from sites like Nippur, Ur, and Lagash provide unprecedented insight into how this system functioned. A typical temple owned thousands of acres of farmland, employed permanent staff numbering in the hundreds, and maintained complex networks of dependent labourers. The temple controlled seed grain distribution, determined which crops would be planted where, collected the harvest, stored surplus, and allocated food rations to urban populations. In effect, temples operated as a combination of a modern government, bank, and agricultural corporation, with divine ownership providing ideological justification for their economic control. The accounting tablets are remarkably detailed. They track individual workers, listing names, job assignments, and ration allocations. They document specialized craftsmen, potters, weavers, metal workers, carpenters who produced goods for temple use or trade. They record tribute from dependent villages, taxes collected from independent farmers, offerings brought by worshippers. Every transaction was documented, every transfer of goods registered, creating paper trails that archaeologists can now follow to reconstruct entire economic systems. And all of this operated under the premise that the temple's wealth belonged to the god, that priests managing resources were stewards rather than owners, that economic authority derived from divine delegation. This religious legitimation of economic power was sophisticated and effective. Kings couldn't simply seize temple wealth without risking religious rebellion. Priests controlled food distribution and could threaten populations with starvation. The god's ownership of land and resources was accepted as fundamental fact rather than political claim, making the system remarkably stable across centuries of political change. When dynasties fell and new rulers seized power, they maintained temple privileges because challenging the divine economic order would undermine their own claims to rule by divine mandate. But this creates interesting questions about the Anunnaki's role in this system. If they were purely mythological constructs, Why build such elaborate economic infrastructure around their supposed ownership? Why not simply claim royal ownership or acknowledge priestly control directly? The answer usually given is that divine ownership prevented any human faction from monopolizing power, creating checks and balances where kings, priests, and temple administrators all claimed to serve divine interests while actually pursuing factional agendas. This interpretation makes political sense and explains the system's stability. Yet it requires believing that elaborate civilization-wide structures were built around entities no one actually expected to show up and audit the accounts, which raises alternative possibilities. What if the original builders of the temple economy genuinely expected the Anunnaki to be present, active, and engaged in oversight? What if early Mesopotamian civilization organized itself around beings it understood as real, creating economic systems designed to serve their actual needs, rather than providing ideological cover for human power structures? The later system could then represent gradual transformation, human administrators maintaining structures originally designed for different purposes, continuing to claim divine authority even as the beings who once exercised that authority became more distant or absent. The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian control gradually shifted where economic power concentrated. Early Sumerian temples operated relatively independently, each city's temple complex functioning as autonomous economic unit loyal to its patron deity. As empires consolidated power, kings attempted to centralize temple administration, appointing loyal priests, redirecting temple revenues, and claiming greater shares of divine wealth. The gods' theoretical ownership remained, but practical control shifted toward royal authority. By the time we reach Babylonian hegemony, temples had become more obviously subordinate to palace power, religious authority yielding to political control even while maintaining theological justifications. This economic transformation paralleled the Anunnaki's transformation in religious texts, from active governing council to distant judges. As temples lost autonomy and became instruments of royal power, the gods whose ownership justified temple wealth became more abstract, more symbolic, less described as actively engaged in economic management. Whether this represents natural institutional evolution or documents actual withdrawal depends on how literally you take the original premise. If divine ownership was always metaphor, then growing abstraction simply made implicit reality explicit. But if divine ownership once represented actual expectation of engagement, then growing abstraction might document recognition that such engagement had ceased, that the Anunnaki had withdrawn from active management of the civilization they'd supposedly established. The beginning of the end came in 539 BCE, when Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon without significant resistance. This moment represents more than just political transfer, it was civilizational transformation. The Persians were Zoroastrians, worshippers of Ahura Mazda, believers in cosmic dualism between good and evil that was fundamentally different from Mesopotamian polytheism. Cyrus presented himself as liberator rather than conqueror, famously allowing exiled peoples to return home and even claiming to have been chosen by Marduk, chief god of Babylon. But his successors were less accommodating. Under Persian rule, temple revenues declined, priestly authority weakened, and the elaborate religious infrastructure that had sustained Anunnaki worship for millennia began crumbling. The texts from this period show something fascinating and sad. Priests continued performing rituals, continued pressing cuneiform tablets, but their writings carry a tone of desperation, of appeal to gods who seemed increasingly distant, of maintaining traditions even as the congregations dwindled and the temples fell into disrepair. The Cyrus cylinder discovered in Babylon's ruins in 1879 records the conquest in Cyrus's own words. He describes entering Babylon peacefully, respecting local gods, restoring damaged temples, and returning displaced populations. This propaganda was partly true. Cyrus did allow exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. He did maintain Babylon's temples initially and claimed legitimacy through Marduk selection rather than conquest. But his religious tolerance had limits. Zoroastrian theology recognized Ahura Mazda as supreme deity with subordinate divine beings serving him. Local gods could be acknowledged but not granted equal status, creating theological hierarchy where Mesopotamian polytheism had maintained divine plurality. More significantly, Persian administrative reforms disrupted the temple economy. The Achaemenid Empire standardized taxation, centralized revenue collection, and redirected resources toward imperial rather than local priorities. Temples still received some income but lost control of vast agricultural lands, lost authority to collect taxes independently, lost economic autonomy that had sustained their power. Priests became state employees rather than autonomous religious authorities, their salaries paid from imperial treasuries, their roles redefined as ritual specialists rather than economic managers. The impact on Anunnaki worship is visible in surviving texts from this period. Temple archives from the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE show declining offerings, reduced ritual activities, prayers that sound increasingly desperate. Priests appealed to traditional gods using ancient formulas, but seemed uncertain those gods were listening. Some texts explicitly lament that divine presence had departed, that the old gods no longer answered prayers, that traditions were being maintained out of duty rather than confident expectation of divine response. This tone of religious melancholy appears across multiple sites, suggesting widespread perception that something fundamental had changed, that relationship between divine and human realms that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years was breaking down. The priestly class itself was aging and not reproducing its knowledge. Training new priests required stability, resources, and cultural confidence in the tradition's future. Persian rule undermined all three. Talented young men increasingly pursued careers in imperial administration, where opportunities seemed better. Families who had held priesthoods for generations couldn't find suitable heirs. The complex knowledge required to read cuneiform, perform proper rituals, and maintain temple operations was literally dying with elderly priests who had no adequate students to replace them. By the late 5th century BCE, decades after the conquest, many temples operated at minimal levels. Daily rituals were shortened or eliminated. Festivals were celebrated with reduced grandeur. Administrative records became sparser, suggesting either less activity to document or fewer scribes capable of documentation. The elaborate cult practices that had maintained Anunnaki worship were simplified or abandoned entirely. And through it all, the texts show priests clinging to hope that the gods would return, that divine favour would restore what Persian rule had diminished, that the old order might somehow be re-established despite overwhelming evidence that an entire way of life was ending. When Alexander the Great swept through Mesopotamia in 331 BCE, he brought more than military conquest. He brought Greek philosophy, Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek ways of understanding the cosmos. The result was Hellenization, the gradual replacement of indigenous culture with Greek alternatives. This process wasn't violent or sudden. It was insidious, generational, appealing. Greek became the language of administration and scholarship. Young elites learned Homer instead of Gilgamesh. Zeus and Apollo began appearing in local art alongside traditional Mesopotamian deities, then gradually replacing them. The Anunnaki, already fading from prominence, became increasingly obscure. Priests who could read cuneiform grew old and died without training successors. The complex mythology that had given these beings context and meaning became fragmented, misunderstood, eventually forgotten. By the time of Alexander's death in 323 BCE, you could walk through Babylon and find Greek temples being built inside the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian sanctuaries, physical manifestation of cultural displacement. Alexander himself showed some respect for Mesopotamian traditions, at least initially. When he entered Babylon in 331 BCE, he ordered repairs to the Temple of Marduk, which had fallen into disrepair under Persian neglect. He participated in Babylonian religious ceremonies, accepted the title King of Babylon according to traditional rites, and claimed to honour the local gods. But his vision was fundamentally Greek. He saw himself as spreading Hellenic civilization to barbarian lands, enlightening the world with Greek culture, philosophy, and political organisation. His respect for local traditions was strategic, designed to ease conquest, not genuine commitment to preserving indigenous ways of life. The real transformation came through his colonization policies. Alexander founded Greek cities throughout his conquered territories, populating them with Greek settlers, veterans from his armies, and locals who adopted Greek customs. These cities, Alexandria, Seleucia, Dura Europos, became centres of Hellenic culture, spreading Greek language and customs through example and economic opportunity. Young Mesopotamians seeking advancement learned Greek, studied Greek literature, adopted Greek dress and manners. Success increasingly required cultural assimilation, and within a generation, indigenous traditions began seeming provincial, outdated, unsophisticated compared to the cosmopolitan appeal of Greek civilization. The gymnasium became the physical centre of this cultural transformation. These weren't just athletic facilities, but educational institutions where young men learned Greek language, philosophy, literature, and physical culture. Attending the gymnasium marked you as civilized, sophisticated, part of the new elite. Those who clung to old ways, who continued speaking Aramaic or Akkadian, who maintained traditional Mesopotamian customs, found themselves increasingly marginalized in their own homeland. Economic opportunities favored the Hellenized. Administrative positions required Greek literacy. Social prestige depended on demonstrating Greek cultural fluency. The impact on religious practice was devastating but gradual. Greek gods didn't violently replace Mesopotamian deities. Instead, they merged with them through a process called syncretism. Marduk became associated with Zeus. Ishtar blended with Aphrodite. Local gods acquired Greek names, Greek attributes, Greek mythological connections. This seemed like accommodation, like preserving local tradition within new framework. But the effect was dissolution. When you call Enki by the name Poseidon, when you describe Inanna through Aphrodite's mythology, when you interpret ancient Mesopotamian gods through Greek philosophical categories, you fundamentally change what those gods mean. The subtle theological distinctions, the specific characteristics, the precise roles that Mesopotamian tradition had maintained for millennia became blurred, simplified, lost in translation. The Anunnaki suffered particularly in this transformation because they had no obvious Greek equivalent. The Council of Seven Judges had no parallel in Greek mythology. Greek underworld had Hades, the Furies, various chthonic spirits, but nothing matching the Anunnaki's specific role as collective fate determiners. As Greek categories increasingly structured how people understood divine realms, beings that didn't fit those categories became incomprehensible, then forgotten. Priests still knew the old names, still performed traditional rituals, but the younger generation educated in gymnasiums couldn't understand why these obscure Mesopotamian deities mattered when Greek gods offered clearer, more philosophically sophisticated theological frameworks. The intellectual appeal of Greek philosophy accelerated this displacement. Plato's ideas about ideal forms, Aristotle's systematic categorization of reality, Stoic ethics and Epicurean materialism, these offered ways of understanding the world that seemed more rational, more coherent than ancient mythology. Educated Mesopotamians began viewing their ancestral traditions as primitive stories that had served their purpose, but were now superseded by Greek wisdom. The Anunnaki weren't rejected violently. They were outgrown, dismissed as relics of less enlightened times, cultural artifacts interesting for historians, but irrelevant to sophisticated modern people living in Alexander's cosmopolitan empire. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals divided the empire. Mesopotamia fell under Seleucid control, and the Hellenization accelerated. The Seleucids founded Seleucia on the Tigris as their capital, a purely Greek city that gradually eclipsed Babylon in importance. Resources flowed to this new centre. Greek became not just preferred, but mandatory for official business. The old cuneiform scribble schools, already struggling, found fewer students, less funding, declining social prestige. By the 2nd century BCE, you could count the number of people who could fluently read and write cuneiform on your hands, and most of them were elderly priests maintaining traditions they knew would die with them. Archaeologists have worked to identify the latest cuneiform tablets mentioning the Anunnaki, and the results are surprisingly precise. The last known text referencing them dates to around 75 CE. A tablet from Uruk describing traditional rituals that were clearly already archaic when the scribe recorded them. But the meaningful end came centuries earlier. After about 200 BCE, references become rare, formulaic, disconnected from living belief. Scribes copying old myths don't seem to understand what they're transmitting. Ritual texts describe ceremonies to gods whose temples no longer exist. It's cultural echo, not vibrant tradition. What's haunting about these final tablets is their ordinariness. There's no dramatic farewell, no apocalyptic description of divine departure, no explanation for why these beings who had supposedly governed Mesopotamia for thousands of years were simply being forgotten. The texts just stop, trailing off mid-tradition, as though the door between divine and human realms had closed so gradually that no one noticed until the silence was complete. The tablet from 75 CE was discovered during German excavations at Uruk in the 1930s. It's a small piece, damaged around the edges, pressed by hands that clearly struggled with the ancient script. The cuneiform is crude compared to tablets from earlier periods, the signs poorly formed, the grammar uncertain. This wasn't a master scribe trained from childhood in traditional schools. This was someone working from memory or copied examples, trying to preserve knowledge they no longer fully understood. The content describes monthly offerings to various deities, including brief mention of the Anunnaki as judges who should receive specific portions. But the ritual instructions are incomplete, referencing ceremonies at temples that no longer existed, calling for priesthoods that had disappeared generations earlier. What makes this final tablet so poignant is the scribe's awareness of ending. A brief colophon at the tablet's end, barely legible, mentions that the writer was recording the old ways so they wouldn't be completely forgotten. This wasn't living tradition being practiced, but historical preservation, an attempt to document customs that were already dead or dying. The scribe knew they were writing for a future that might never understand, preserving fragments of a worldview that their own generation no longer shared. Between 200 BCE and 75 CE lies a strange twilight period where Mesopotamian religion existed as historical artifact rather than living faith. A few elderly priests still performed rituals in crumbling temples. Scholars interested in antiquity studied old tablets the way we study ancient texts today, as windows into vanished worlds. Some families maintained traditional practices out of ancestral loyalty, keeping small shrines, speaking old prayers, but without the community support and institutional infrastructure that had once sustained elaborate cult activity. It was religion as nostalgia, tradition as performance, belief maintained through habit rather than confident expectation that the gods were actually listening. The references to the Anunnaki in these late texts are particularly telling. Early tablets describe them as active participants in cosmic governance, making decisions, pronouncing judgments, engaging with other gods and with humanity. Middle period texts treated them as established authorities whose roles were taken for granted. But these final texts describe them almost as distant legends, beings who had once been important but whose relevance had faded. The scribes recorded their names dutifully, but without the urgency and immediacy that characterized earlier religious literature. It's the difference between writing about people you know and writing about historical figures you've read about but never encountered. Some scholars have searched for explicit explanations in these final texts, hoping to find some explanation for why the Anunnaki disappeared from Mesopotamian consciousness. Did priests record divine visions announcing withdrawal? Did prophets explain why the gods had fallen silent? But the tablets offer nothing so dramatic. There are no apocalyptic pronouncements, no theological explanations, no attempts to make sense of abandonment. The texts simply become less frequent, less detailed, less confident, until they stop entirely. This gradual fading suggests the end wasn't experienced as sudden abandonment, but as slow realization that prayers were going unanswered, that the divine presence that had once seemed tangible had become increasingly remote, that traditions were being maintained more from duty than from faith. The archaeological context of these final tablets reinforces their sadness. They've been found scattered in ruins, not carefully archived in temple libraries, but discarded or lost. Some were found in domestic contexts, suggesting they'd been removed from temples and kept by private individuals after official cult practices ceased. Others were discovered in dumps, literally thrown away when their contents became irrelevant. This physical displacement mirrors the cultural displacement, sacred texts becoming trash as the worldview that gave them meaning collapsed. While Greco-Roman culture transformed the Mediterranean world, another revolution was transforming religion itself. Judaism, Christianity, and eventually Islam offered something Mesopotamian polytheism couldn't: exclusive truth. You couldn't worship both Yahweh and the Anunnaki. You couldn't serve both Allah and Enki. Monotheism demanded absolute loyalty, and in return it offered clarity, moral certainty, and a direct relationship with the divine that didn't require temple bureaucracy or priestly intermediaries. This was partly theological evolution, but it was also political survival. Small communities facing Roman persecution found identity through exclusive commitment to one god. That fierce loyalty gave them cohesion, purpose, resistance that polytheistic tolerance couldn't match. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and Islam later conquered the Middle East, the Anunnaki faced something they'd never encountered before. Not competing gods, but the assertion that they had never existed at all, that belief in multiple deities was not just wrong, but morally corrupting, that humanity had been deceived by demons pretending to be gods. The Anunnaki weren't defeated. They were redefined out of existence, transformed from revered judges of fate into dangerous delusions that righteous humans needed to reject. The monotheistic revolution had been brewing for centuries before it achieved dominance. Judaism had emerged from polytheistic Canaanite religion through a process scholars still debate, gradually consolidating worship around Yahweh alone and rejecting other deities as false. This exclusivity seemed strange to ancient polytheists, who typically assumed all peoples had their own gods and saw no contradiction in acknowledging multiple divine powers. But Jewish insistence that Yahweh was the only true God, that all other deities were either non-existent or demonic, created a fundamentally different religious framework. Christianity inherited and intensified this exclusivity. The early church fathers wrote extensively against paganism, arguing that the old gods were either delusions or demons deceiving humanity. When Christians encountered Mesopotamian deities, including references to the Anunnaki in texts that were still being copied during Christianity's early centuries, they classified them as false gods, whose worship was not just misguided but spiritually dangerous. St. Augustine's City of God and similar apologetic works systematically dismantled pagan theology, arguing that apparent divine activity was either human imagination or demonic deception. The Anunnaki, to Christian theologians, were at best mythological fictions and at worst malevolent spiritual beings whose worship had led ancient peoples into error. This theological assault was backed by political power once Christianity became Rome's official religion in the 4th century CE. Pagan temples were closed or converted to churches. Traditional rituals were banned. Priesthoods were disbanded or absorbed into Christian ecclesiastical structures. The old gods weren't just intellectually discredited, but legally prohibited. Anyone maintaining traditional polytheistic practices faced persecution, from social ostracism to legal punishment to violence from zealous Christian mobs who saw themselves as purifying the world of demonic influence. The impact on residual Mesopotamian religious practice was total. The few remaining families who maintained traditional worship found themselves classified as pagans, practitioners of illegal and immoral religion. Their gods, including the Anunnaki, were declared demons. Their rituals were criminalized. Their texts were destroyed or locked away. Conversion to Christianity became not just spiritually necessary, but politically and economically mandatory. Those who refused lost property, social standing, legal rights. Within a generation or two, open practice of traditional Mesopotamian religion had completely ceased. Islam's conquest of Mesopotamia in the 7th century CE reinforced this erasure. Islamic theology also insisted on absolute monotheism, rejecting polytheistic beliefs as shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with Allah. The old gods were classified as jinn or shaitan, spiritual beings whose worship represented dangerous error. Islamic scholars preserved some ancient texts for historical interest, but made clear that the religious practices they described were jahiliyyah. The ignorance of pre-Islamic times that enlightened Muslims had surpassed. What makes monotheism's triumph particularly final is its theological structure. Polytheistic religions could accommodate new gods, could syncretize different traditions, could recognize divine plurality. But monotheism, by its nature, cannot compromise. One god means not many gods. The Anunnaki couldn't be reinterpreted or absorbed into monotheistic frameworks the way they'd been syncretized with Greek deities. They could only be rejected, classified as false, declared non-existent or demonic. This categorical rejection meant that unlike previous religious transformations, where old gods continued in diminished form or under new names, monotheism required complete erasure. The psychological appeal of monotheism helps explain its success. Polytheism required navigating complex divine hierarchies, remembering which god controlled which domain, performing different rituals for different purposes. Monotheism simplified everything. One god, one prayer, one clear moral framework. For ordinary people struggling with daily survival, this clarity was attractive. Why maintain elaborate cult practices for multiple deities when you could direct all devotion to one supreme being who cared personally about your fate? Why memorize complex mythologies when simple faith in one god's goodness provided adequate spiritual foundation? The transformation wasn't purely top-down. Many people converted genuinely, finding in monotheism answers that polytheism hadn't provided. The promise of personal relationship with the divine, without requiring priestly mediation or temple access, was democratizing. The moral clarity of monotheistic ethics, with clear commandments and defined virtues, seemed more coherent than polytheistic moral systems, where different gods modeled different values, and the promise of afterlife judgment based on righteousness, rather than social status or ritual knowledge, offered hope to poor and oppressed populations. For the Anunnaki, this meant not just loss of worshippers, but loss of conceptual space. In a polytheistic world, even forgotten gods could theoretically return to relevance, but in monotheistic framework, they couldn't exist at all. They were written out of reality itself, transformed from beings who determined fate to non-entities whose supposed existence was proof of ancient humanity's spiritual confusion. This theological annihilation was more complete than any physical destruction could be. One of the saddest elements of this story is what happened to the hereditary priesthoods. For thousands of years, certain families held exclusive rights to serve in specific temples, to perform particular rituals, to speak with the voices of particular gods. These weren't casual positions, they were identities, passed from father to son across generations, encoded in family names and maintained through rigorous training. As temples closed and religious practice faded, these priests faced an impossible choice. Some converted to Christianity or Judaism, carrying their spiritual instincts into new traditions. Some continued performing rituals in secret, maintaining fragments of old practice even as their congregations disappeared. Archaeological evidence suggests some priestly families simply vanished from historical record, their lineages ending as sons chose different paths, or didn't survive the turbulent transition between ancient and medieval worlds. By the 4th century CE, you could no longer find anyone alive who had been trained in the traditional mysteries of Enki, or knew the proper hymns to summon the Anunnaki's attention. An entire knowledge system had disappeared in 3 or 4 generations, leaving only clay tablets that no one could read. The priestly family's genealogies can be traced through temple archives for generations, sometimes centuries. At Uruk, the Sinleki Unini family served as scribes and priests for over 400 years, each generation training the next in cuneiform literacy, ritual knowledge, and priestly duties. At Sippar, the Shanguni-Nurta family maintained the Temple of the Sun God for similar durations. These weren't just jobs but vocations, calling, identity so deep that it structured every aspect of family life. Children were raised from birth knowing they would serve the gods. Training began early, sons learning beside fathers, memorizing prayers, practicing ritual gestures, studying the ancient texts that contained mysteries essential to maintaining cosmic order. The knowledge these families preserved was encyclopedic. They didn't just memorize prayers, but understood complex theological systems, astronomical calculations for determining festival dates, herbal lore for preparing ritual materials, musical traditions for temple hymns, architectural principles for maintaining sacred spaces. They knew the mythologies in detail, could recite creation epics, flood narratives, divine genealogies. They understood the me, the fundamental principles of civilization that Enki had established, and that proper ritual maintained. This knowledge wasn't written down completely. Much was transmitted orally, father to son, in private instruction that never made it into archived tablets. As Persian rule weakened temple infrastructure and Hellenization made traditional priesthood less prestigious, maintaining these lineages became increasingly difficult. Fathers looked at their sons and saw the future closing. Why train boys in obsolete cuneiform when Greek literacy offered better opportunities? Why dedicate lives to serving gods whose temples were crumbling when other careers provided stable income? Some families persisted out of loyalty to ancestral duty, but with each generation more lineages broke. Sons chose different paths, daughters married outside priestly families. The knowledge chains snapped, and when they broke, they couldn't be repaired. The last priest faced terrible isolation. Imagine being the final person alive who knows how to perform rituals your family has maintained for 1,000 years. You're old. Your congregation has dwindled to a handful of equally elderly believers. The temple building is deteriorating, funds for maintenance exhausted. You teach your son the prayers, but you can see he doesn't really believe, that he's humouring you, that after you die he won't continue. What do you do? How do you process being the end of a tradition that stretches back beyond memory, back to the gods themselves? Some late-period texts capture this desperation. There are prayers from the Seleucid era asking gods to preserve priestly knowledge, lamenting that quote 13 begging for divine intervention to restore faith. There are ritual texts meticulously copied, as though comprehensive documentation might somehow preserve what living practice could no longer maintain. There are personal inscriptions expressing grief at watching traditions die, at being unable to prevent the erasure of everything ancestors had built and preserved. Archaeological evidence shows some priests literally buried sacred objects rather than let them be lost or profaned. Excavations have found caches of ritual vessels, divine statues, and cuneiform tablets deliberately buried in temple foundations, hidden away as though priests hoped some future generation might rediscover and restore them. These weren't random disposals, but careful depositions, sacred materials entrusted to the earth for safekeeping. The priests who buried them must have known they were closing a chapter of history, making final gestures of preservation before the door shut completely. The conversion of priestly families to Christianity is documented in some cases. We know of families who served Mesopotamian temples for generations, who by the 4th century CE show up in Christian records as bishops or monks. They carried their religious instincts into new contexts, their depth of spiritual training finding expression in Christian monasticism or ecclesiastical authority. But they did so by completely renouncing their ancestral traditions, by declaring their forefathers had been deceived, by participating in the erasure of everything their families had previously maintained. This must have created profound psychological conflict, a kind of spiritual patricide where honouring the dead required rejecting everything they'd believed and practiced. For roughly 1,500 years, between the fall of the last cuneiform scribes and the rise of modern archaeology, the Anunnaki existed only as vague biblical references to pagan demons or obscure mentions in classical texts. Their cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, were buried beneath desert sand, visible only as strange hills in otherwise flat landscape. Local Arab populations told stories about jinns dwelling in the ruins, but had no connection to the civilizations that had built them. This nearly complete erasure is why 19th century European archaeologists were so shocked by what they found. When Austin Henry Layard, Hormuzd Rassam, and others began systematic excavations in Iraq during the 1840s and 50s, they uncovered not primitive villages but sophisticated urban centres with paved streets, complex architecture, advanced infrastructure, and above all libraries. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, still perfectly preserved by the dry climate and the fire that had baked many of them during ancient destructions. As translators began reading these tablets, an entire lost world emerged from silence. And in that world, mentioned constantly, treated as real, documented in text after text, were beings called the Anunnaki who had governed, judged, and according to the ancient people themselves taught humans everything they knew. The tells, artificial hills formed by centuries of human habitation, dotted the Iraqi landscape, mysterious mounds rising from flat plains. Local populations knew they were ancient, knew they contained ruins, but had no specific knowledge of what civilizations had built them or when. Some tells had acquired legendary status. Jinn stories explain the ruins as dwelling places for supernatural beings. Buried treasure myths drew occasional looters who dug randomly, finding scattered artifacts without understanding their context or significance. But systematic understanding of what these mounds represented didn't exist until European archaeologists began excavating them with scientific methodology. Austin Henry Layard arrived in Mosul in 1845 and began excavating Nimrud and Nineveh, ancient Assyrian capitals. What he found exceeded anyone's expectations. Massive palace complexes with intricate carved reliefs depicting battles, religious ceremonies, royal hunts, libraries containing thousands of cuneiform tablets, sculptures of human-headed winged bulls weighing tons. This wasn't primitive prehistory. This was sophisticated civilization with art, literature, complex administration, and monumental architecture. News of Layard's discoveries electrified Europe. Museums competed for artifacts. Scholars rushed to learn cuneiform. Suddenly, an entire lost world was being recovered from sand and silence. As excavations extended south from Assyria to Babylonia and ancient Sumer, the discoveries became even more remarkable. At Leonard Woolley uncovered royal tombs containing treasures of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, evidence of wealth and artistry from 4,500 years ago. At Uruk, German archaeologists found temple complexes and administrative archives, documenting urban life in humanity's first cities. At Nippur, American excavations recovered over 50,000 tablets. the largest archive of cuneiform texts ever discovered, documenting every aspect of temple administration across centuries. The clay tablets themselves were revelations. Modern people were accustomed to thinking of writing as recent invention, perhaps 3,000 years old at most. But these tablets pushed literacy back another 2,000 years, demonstrating that complex writing systems existed in the 4th millennium BCE. More shocking was the content. These weren't simple records of trade goods, they were sophisticated literature, epic poetry, wisdom literature, hymns, myths, historical chronicles, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, legal codes, medical texts. The Sumerians and their successors had created complete intellectual culture, grappling with questions about human existence, cosmic order, divine justice, and life's meaning. As translators worked through the tablets, the Anunnaki kept appearing. They were mentioned in king lists, described in myths, invoked in prayers, referenced in administrative documents. The texts treated them as fundamental to Mesopotamian worldview, beings whose existence was taken for granted, whose authority structured religious and political life. For scholars trained in biblical tradition, where Genesis briefly mentioned Nephilim and other mysterious beings, finding extensive documentation of a divine council called the Anunnaki was startling. These weren't vague mythological references. These were detailed accounts treating these beings as real, active participants in human history. The recovery of this lost world happened just as Europeans were developing theories about human cultural evolution. Scholars assumed civilization developed linearly, primitive societies gradually advancing towards sophistication. But Sumerian evidence complicated this narrative. Here was advanced civilization existing 5,000 years ago, already possessing writing, mathematics, astronomy, literature, complex theology. Where did it come from? How did it develop? The texts themselves suggested divine origin, attributing civilization's founding to beings who descended from heaven. Western scholars dismissed this as mythology, but the Sumerians' own explanations for their achievements kept pointing toward external instruction, toward knowledge given rather than independently developed. This tension between archaeological evidence and ancient testimony continues today. We've recovered thousands of tablets documenting Anunnaki beliefs spanning millennia. We've excavated their temples, catalogued their worship, analysed their mythology. We understand, academically, how Mesopotamian religion functioned. But we're no closer to answering the question that troubled even the first archaeologists. Why did ancient people believe so completely in these beings? Why did they organise entire civilization around serving them? Why did they document the Anunnaki's activities with same matter-of-fact precision they used for documenting barley transactions? And why, when these beings supposedly disappeared, did no one record an explanation, as though the answer was so obvious it required no documentation, or so painful it couldn't be spoken? The process of understanding the Anunnaki has been painstakingly slow, spanning more than a century of archaeological and linguistic work. Early translators like Henry Rawlinson and George Smith could recognize the cuneiform signs but struggled with context, with understanding how Sumerian grammar worked, with distinguishing mythology from historical record. It wasn't until scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer devoted entire careers to mastering Sumerian language and literature that coherent pictures began emerging. Kramer's work in the mid-20th century was revolutionary. He translated the Sumerian creation myths, the earliest versions of flood narratives, the poems describing divine behavior and cosmic organization. What emerged was a complex theological system where the Anunnaki played a specific, consistent role. They were judges, administrators, cosmic bureaucrats who determined human fate and maintained universal order. But Kramer also noted something that troubled him. The Sumerians described these beings with a concreteness that seemed different from how other ancient cultures described their gods. There was specificity, detail, a quality that resembled historical record more than abstract mythology. He never claimed they were aliens or ancient astronauts, but he acknowledged the descriptions were unusual enough to merit serious attention, rather than dismissive classification as simple religious fantasy. The early decipherment of cuneiform was a detective story spanning decades. Henry Rawlinson's work on the Behistun inscription in the 1840s provided the breakthrough, a multilingual text that functioned like a Rosetta Stone for ancient Near Eastern languages. But recognizing individual signs was only the beginning. Understanding how Sumerian grammar functioned, how words connected, how meaning emerged from combinations of signs, this required patient work by generations of scholars comparing texts, building dictionaries, testing translations against each other to identify errors and refine understanding. George Smith's discovery and translation of the Flood Tablet in 1872 captured public imagination. Here was a version of the Noah story predating the Bible by over 1,000 years, proof that biblical narratives had ancient Mesopotamian precursors. But Smith's translation was rough, his understanding of context limited. He could convey the general story but missed nuances, mistranslated key passages, and couldn't place the flood narrative within its broader mythological framework. The tablet mentioned the Anunnaki, but Smith didn't know what the term meant, rendering it simply as _14_. It took another 50 years before Sumerian itself, as opposed to later Akkadian, could be read with confidence. Sumerian was the older language, the one in which the earliest texts were composed. But it was also completely unrelated to any known language family. Its grammar followed rules unlike anything translators had encountered. Early attempts at translation produced nonsense because scholars applied Semitic grammatical assumptions to a non-Semitic language. Only gradually, through comparison of hundreds of texts, through identification of grammatical patterns, through painstaking reconstruction of vocabulary, did Sumerian become readable. Samuel Noah Kramer devoted his career to this work. Born in Ukraine, emigrated to America, studied at Temple University and the University of Pennsylvania, he became the foremost Sumerian scholar of the 20th century. His doctoral work in the 1930s focused on Sumerian literary texts, and he spent the next 5 decades translating, publishing, and analysing the corpus. His book History Begins at Sumer introduced general audiences to Sumerian achievements, the first schools, the first legal codes, the first literary debates, the first recorded proverbs. But his scholarly work went deeper, piecing together fragmented tablets to reconstruct complete myths, identifying literary conventions, and building comprehensive understanding of Sumerian theology. When Kramer encountered the Anunnaki in text after text, he approached them with scholarly rigour. He documented their appearances, noted consistency across sources, traced how their roles evolved from early Sumerian to later Babylonian texts. His translations were careful, qualified, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed. He never speculated beyond what the evidence supported, but in lectures and in private conversations, colleagues remember him expressing puzzlement about certain aspects of Anunnaki descriptions, the bureaucratic quality of their organisation, the specificity of their roles, the matter-of-fact way texts treated their existence. It didn't fit patterns from other ancient mythologies he'd studied. Kramer's academic integrity meant he never published these doubts as conclusions. He maintained that the Anunnaki were gods, that the texts were religious literature, that standard interpretive frameworks applied. But he also encouraged the younger scholars not to dismiss the unusual qualities, to remain open to nuance, to recognise that ancient people's beliefs deserved respectful attention, even when those beliefs seemed strange to modern sensibilities. This balance between scholarly rigour and intellectual openness characterised his career and influenced how subsequent generations approached Mesopotamian religion. The community of Assyriologists and Sumerologists remained small throughout the 20th century. Perhaps a few dozen scholars worldwide with expertise to read and translate original texts, This meant progress was slow, but also meant quality control was high. Major translations were reviewed, debated, corrected by peers who could check work against original tablets. The consensus that emerged about the Anunnaki was built on thousands of careful judgments by scholars who spent lifetimes mastering linguistic and cultural context necessary to understand what ancient texts were actually saying. But this same insularity made the academic community vulnerable when alternative interpretations emerged. Scholars assumed their careful work would speak for itself, that anyone seriously interested would recognize the difference between rigorous translation and speculative interpretation. They underestimated how compelling alternative narratives could be, how much broader audiences wanted answers rather than careful qualifications, and how little most people understood about the difference between trained scholarly work and self-taught speculation. Central to Zechariah Sitchin's ancient astronaut theory was the planet Nibiru, which he claimed was a 12th planet in our solar system with a 3,600-year elliptical orbit. According to Sitchin, this planet was the homeworld of the Anunnaki, and its periodic return to the inner solar system explained cycles of catastrophe and divine intervention in human history. The problem is that professional astronomers and Assyriologists immediately identified fatal problems with this claim. First, the cuneiform term Sitchin translated as planet actually referred to various celestial crossings or specific star positions. Second, Sumerian astronomical texts, which are quite sophisticated, never describe a planet with such an orbit. Third, physics makes such an orbit impossible. A planet approaching that close to the inner solar system would cause gravitational disruptions we'd observe throughout the solar system's history. NASA, the International Astronomical Union, and every major observatory have stated unequivocally that Nibiru does not exist. Yet belief persists, partly because Sitchin's theory offers a compelling narrative that seems to explain multiple ancient mysteries at once. This highlights a crucial question we must consider. Why do speculative theories about ancient astronauts feel more satisfying to many people than the actual archaeological evidence? What does that tell us about human psychology, our relationship with the past, and our deep need to believe we were once guided by beings wiser than ourselves? The astronomical argument against Nibiru is straightforward and devastating. If a planet-sized object had an orbit bringing it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, we would observe its effects throughout the solar system. Planetary orbits would show perturbations. Asteroid belt distributions would reflect repeated gravitational influence. Most importantly, we would have observed this planet during its supposed previous approaches. Ancient astronomers were skilled observers who documented what they saw. Greek, Babylonian, Chinese, and Indian astronomical records from 2,000 years ago are extensive and precise. None mention a rogue planet approaching Earth. Modern telescopes have mapped objects throughout the solar system, including distant Kuiper Belt objects and theoretical Planet 9 far beyond Neptune. There is no room in the solar system's gravitational dynamics for an additional planet with Sitchin's proposed orbit. Assyriologists addressed Sitchin's linguistic arguments with equal directness. The cuneiform term he translated as referring to Nibiru, Neberu, appears in multiple contexts in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. It means crossing or ferry point, used variously to describe river crossings, mountain passes, or specific astronomical positions where planetary paths intersected with celestial reference points. In astronomical contexts, different texts use Neberu to refer to Jupiter, to describe the spring equinox point, or to indicate where a planet's path crossed the ecliptic. What it never means is a specific planet with the characteristics Sitchin described. His translation required ignoring standard cuneiform dictionaries, dismissing how the term was used in hundreds of other texts, and inventing meanings unsupported by linguistic evidence. But pointing out these errors didn't stop Sitchin's theory from spreading. By the time professional responses were published, his books had already sold millions of copies and been translated into dozens of languages. Television documentaries featured his ideas. Internet forums debated his interpretations. An entire alternative history community emerged. Treating Sitchin as misunderstood genius, opposed by closed-minded academics protecting orthodox narratives. The more scholars criticized his work, the more his supporters viewed criticism as evidence of conspiracy or narrow-mindedness. This phenomenon reveals something important about how people process information about the past. Sitchin's narrative was clear, complete, and emotionally satisfying. It explained human origins, gave purpose to ancient civilizations, and suggested humanity had cosmic significance. Academic responses were technical, negative, and offered no comparable alternative narrative. Scholars could prove Sitchin wrong, but couldn't provide explanations that felt as meaningful to audiences seeking answers to profound questions about human existence and purpose. The psychological appeal of ancient astronaut theories extends beyond individual curiosity. They offer modern secular audiences a way to experience wonder and cosmic connection without requiring traditional religious faith. If aliens created us, we're part of a larger cosmic story without needing to accept theological claims. If ancient gods were actually extraterrestrials, mythology becomes proto-science rather than primitive superstition. This reframing allows people to take ancient texts seriously while maintaining modern scientific worldview, or at least appearing to. There's also an element of democratization. Academic expertise requires years of specialized training most people can't access. But anyone can read Sitchin's books and feel they understand ancient mysteries scholars supposedly miss. This levels intellectual hierarchies, making everyone's interpretation potentially valid regardless of training. The appeal of this democratization shouldn't be underestimated, especially in cultures suspicious of expert authority and invested in individual judgment. But there's a cost to replacing rigorous analysis with appealing speculation. We lose accuracy. We miss what ancient texts actually said in favor of what we want them to say. We project modern concerns onto past societies that had their own very different contexts and meanings, and we risk dismissing genuine mysteries that deserve serious investigation because they've been associated with discredited theories. The question of why civilization emerged when and where it did remains genuinely puzzling. Sitchin's answer is wrong, but the question itself is legitimate and important. Let me be very clear about what researchers who spend their lives studying cuneiform texts and excavating Mesopotamian sites actually believe about the Anunnaki. The consensus is overwhelming and consistent. The Anunnaki were deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, comparable to the Olympian gods of Greece or the Aesir of Norse mythology. They represented one class of divine beings among several, with specific mythological functions centered on judgment and fate. They were not physical rulers, not extraterrestrials, not genetic engineers. Every major Assyriologist, from Samuel Noah Kramer to Thorkild Jacobsen to Jeremy Black, has stated this unambiguously. The texts themselves provide no support for alternative interpretations once you understand Sumerian language and literary conventions. When ancient scribes describe the Anunnaki, they use the same religious vocabulary they use for all deities. They place them in the same mythological contexts, describe them with the same metaphors, worship them through the same rituals. There's no linguistic or archaeological evidence suggesting the Anunnaki were different from other gods except in their specific mythological roles. This doesn't mean the myths are meaningless. Scholar after scholar has emphasized that Mesopotamian religion was sophisticated, philosophically rich, and addressed fundamental questions about justice, cosmic order, and humanity's place in the universe. But gods, however sophisticated the theology surrounding them, remain gods, powerful ideas that shape civilization without requiring physical existence. The scholarly consensus rests on cumulative evidence from multiple disciplines. Linguists analyzed how divine beings were described grammatically and found no distinctions suggesting some gods were fundamentally different from others. The divine determinative sign, the star-shaped cuneiform mark appearing before god names, was used consistently for all deities, including the Anunnaki. The vocabulary describing divine actions, divine attributes, and divine nature was shared across the pantheon. There was no separate linguistic category for beings who were gods but not really gods, or physical beings mistaken for gods. Art historians examined thousands of cylinder seals, temple reliefs, and sculptural representations of divine beings. They found consistent iconographic conventions for depicting divinity: horned crowns, specific postures, associations with particular symbols. The Anunnaki, when depicted, used these same conventions. They weren't shown differently from other gods in ways that might suggest ancient artists understood them as fundamentally distinct category of beings. Visual representations supported textual evidence that Mesopotamians classified the Anunnaki as gods, using all the cultural markers their society employed to indicate divinity. Archaeologists excavating temple sites found that worship practices for the Anunnaki matched worship practices for other deities. Same ritual structures, same offering types, same priestly organizations, same architectural conventions for sacred spaces. If the Anunnaki had been understood as something other than gods, say, as physical rulers or extraterrestrial visitors, we'd expect different treatment, different spatial organization, different ritual practices. But archaeological evidence shows thorough consistency, indicating ancient Mesopotamians approached the Anunnaki through same religious frameworks they used for entire pantheon. Anthropologists and comparative religion scholars placed Mesopotamian theology within broader context of how human societies create and maintain religious belief systems. The Anunnaki's characteristics, their mythological roles, their relationships with other divine beings, their connection to natural and social order matched patterns seen in divine councils throughout world religions. The Mesopotamian divine assembly resembled Greek divine councils on Olympus, Norse gatherings in Asgard, Canaanite assemblies of El's sons. These structural similarities suggested common ways humans organize religious thinking, rather than unique situation requiring extraordinary explanations. But here's what makes the scholarly consensus both solid and frustrating. It's built on evidence that's technical, requires specialized training to evaluate, and doesn't satisfy deep human questions about meaning and origin. When scholars say the Anunnaki were gods, they mean something specific: cultural constructs created by human imagination to explain natural phenomena, maintain social order, and provide meaning to existence. This is sophisticated anthropological and cognitive understanding of religion's role in human societies. But it can sound dismissive, as though scholars are saying ancient beliefs were merely false, merely primitive, merely mistakes that modern rationality has corrected. Most scholars don't mean it that way. They recognize religious thinking addresses real human needs, that mythology can contain psychological and philosophical truths even when not describing physical reality, that ancient theology can be sophisticated even when wrong about cosmology. Thorkild Jacobson's work particularly emphasized this, showing how Mesopotamian religion grappled with genuine questions about justice, suffering, and human limitation. Jeremy Black's commentaries on Sumerian literature highlighted literary artistry and emotional depth in myths. These scholars took ancient beliefs seriously as intellectual achievements worthy of respect. But respecting ancient beliefs as sophisticated cultural expressions is different from believing they describe literal physical reality. And this difference creates the gap between academic consensus and popular fascination with alternative theories. People want ancient texts to reveal hidden truths about physical reality. Scholars argue the texts reveal truths about human psychology, social organization, and existential questioning. Both perspectives can be valid, but they're asking fundamentally different questions and seeking different kinds of answers. Here's what troubles even skeptical scholars. While the ancient astronaut theory is unsupported by evidence, the question that inspired it remains genuinely mysterious. Why did civilization appear so suddenly in Mesopotamia? Archaeological record shows human beings living in small agricultural villages for thousands of years, and then, within a few centuries around 5,000 years ago, we get cities, writing, advanced mathematics, monumental architecture, sophisticated irrigation, bronze metallurgy, and complex political organisation. This is the Neolithic Revolution, and while mainstream archaeology explains it as the accumulated result of thousands of years of gradual human innovation, the speed of transformation still surprises researchers. Some scholars like Ian Hodder and Klaus Schmidt have suggested that Göbekli Tepe and similar sites indicate we've underestimated how advanced pre-literate societies were. Others argue that climate changes at the end of the last ice age created optimal conditions for rapid cultural development. But questions persist. Why did the Sumerians themselves attribute their knowledge to divine beings who came down from heaven? Why did they describe the founding of their cities as deliberate acts by specific gods rather than gradual human development? Were they simply explaining their own innovations through religious metaphor? Or were they preserving memory of actual teachers whose identities were later mythologized? We'll likely never know with certainty, but the question deserves better than dismissal, and better than fantastical answers that replace mystery with confident speculation. The speed of Mesopotamian development is genuinely puzzling. Around 6000 BCE, people in the region lived in small farming villages, growing basic crops, herding animals, making simple pottery. Their technology was Neolithic: stone tools, no metals, no writing, no cities. By 3000 BCE, 2,000 years later, southern Mesopotamia had cities of tens of thousands of people, monumental ziggurats reaching toward heaven, sophisticated bronze weapons and tools, cuneiform writing recording everything from poetry to accounting, advanced mathematics, precise astronomy, and complex political hierarchies. This represents transformation almost unprecedented in human history. Standard explanations point to environmental factors. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided water for irrigation, enabling agricultural surplus that freed people from subsistence farming. Population growth created larger communities. Larger communities enabled specialization. Specialized craftsmen developed new technologies. Writing emerged to track economic transactions. Political hierarchies developed to manage irrigation systems and distribute resources. Each innovation built on previous ones, creating accelerating development once threshold conditions were met. This explanation is reasonable and supported by evidence from other regions where similar processes occurred. But the Mesopotamian case remains distinctive for its speed and comprehensiveness. In Egypt, civilization developed gradually over a similar time frame but emerged from clearly traceable antecedents. In the Indus Valley, urban civilization appeared suddenly around 5,000 years ago, but seems to have developed from prior cultures in the region. In Mesopotamia, the archaeological transition from village to city culture is compressed into relatively few centuries, and the sophistication achieved by early Sumerian civilization seems disproportionate to visible antecedents. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to 11,000 years ago, have forced archaeologists to revise assumptions about pre-agricultural societies. These hunter-gatherers built monumental stone temples requiring organized labor, sophisticated planning, and abstract religious thinking. If pre-agricultural societies could achieve this, perhaps we've systematically underestimated what humans accomplished before written records begin. Perhaps the innovations visible in Sumerian cities represented culmination of developments that had been occurring invisibly for millennia, with earlier evidence lost or not yet discovered. Climate change at the end of the last ice age created new environmental conditions across the Middle East. Warming temperatures and changing rainfall patterns made previously marginal lands productive for agriculture. These optimal conditions appeared relatively suddenly in geological terms, perhaps explaining why cultural development accelerated when it did. Humans had the capacity for civilization all along. They just needed environmental conditions that made settled agriculture advantageous. But these explanations, while plausible, don't fully account for the Sumerians' own understanding of their history. They didn't describe gradual development. They described sudden founding. They credited specific gods with teaching specific skills. They treated the moment, quote 16, as distinct event rather than gradual process. They maintained that their cities had been founded in deliberate acts by divine beings who chose locations, established temples, and organized social structures. This might be entirely mythological. Retrojection of religious beliefs onto historical development, whose actual processes they didn't understand. But the specificity and consistency of their claims deserves acknowledgement as something to be explained rather than merely dismissed. One possibility rarely discussed in academic literature is that actual individuals played roles in Mesopotamian development that were later mythologized. Perhaps certain charismatic leaders, perhaps travelling groups bringing knowledge from more advanced regions, perhaps refugees from coastal areas flooded at the end of the Ice Age. Perhaps real people contributed knowledge and leadership that accelerated development and were then elevated to divine status in cultural memory. This doesn't require ancient astronauts or supernatural intervention. It just requires acknowledging that exceptional individuals can transform societies and that the line between historical figures and legendary ones blurs across millennia. The mystery isn't whether humans were capable of developing civilization independently. Obviously they were, and obviously they did. The mystery is why the Sumerians described their development in ways that emphasized external instruction, rather than internal innovation, and whether those descriptions preserved any kernel of historical memory that our interpretive frameworks make it difficult to recognize. This question remains open not because evidence is lacking, but because our theoretical frameworks may be inadequate to the complexity of what actually happened 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia. The final truth about what erased the Anunnaki isn't dramatic. There was no cosmic war, no sudden departure, no apocalyptic event. The end came through cultural transformation, linguistic replacement, religious evolution, and the simple passage of time. The Persian conquest weakened temples economically. Hellenization made Greek culture more prestigious than indigenous traditions. Monotheism offered competing religious frameworks that were simpler, more universal. And backed by expanding empires, each generation remembered slightly less than the previous one. Fewer children learned cuneiform. Fewer families maintained old rituals. Fewer people believed the old gods were listening. By the 1st century of the Common Era, you could count the people who still knew the Anunnaki's myths on your fingers. By the 3rd century, they were gone, survived only by clay tablets buried beneath sand, waiting for a future that could read them again. This is how civilizations end. Not in fire and catastrophe, but in gradual forgetting, in children who choose different paths, in the slow fade of memory until what was once universal becomes obscure, becomes forgotten, becomes lost. The event that erased the Anunnaki was simply time, paired with human tendency to adapt, to change, to let old things die when new things seem more relevant. Which means they didn't leave us. We left them. We walked away from our oldest gods, from the beings who supposedly taught us civilization, and we forgot they'd ever existed until archaeologists dug them back into light 2,000 years later, still waiting in the darkness, pressed into clay, trying to tell us something we'd long since stopped listening for. This quiet ending is perhaps more profound than any catastrophic scenario could be. It reveals something essential about how human cultures actually change, how even the most fundamental beliefs can dissolve across generations without anyone quite noticing until they're gone. The Anunnaki weren't erased by their enemies or destroyed by divine opponents. They were simply forgotten by people who found new gods, new stories, new ways of understanding the world that seemed more relevant to current needs than ancient traditions inherited from increasingly distant ancestors. The process unfolded across centuries, each generation's small choices accumulating into civilizational transformation. A father decides his son should learn Greek instead of cuneiform because Greek literacy offers better economic opportunities. A young woman marries into a Christian family and converts, bringing her children up in new faith while maintaining some old practices privately. A priest grows old without training a successor because no one volunteers. No one believes strongly enough to dedicate their life to serving gods who seem increasingly distant. None of these individual choices feels catastrophic. Each represents practical adaptation to changing circumstances. But multiply these choices across millions of people over generations and you get complete erasure. The temples didn't all close at once. They declined gradually, operating at reduced capacity, maintaining diminished rituals, until finally the resources or personnel to continue simply weren't available. The tablets weren't deliberately destroyed. They were abandoned, left in empty buildings that eventually collapsed, buried by windblown sand and accumulated debris. The knowledge wasn't forcibly suppressed. It was simply not transmitted, allowed to die with aging specialists who had no students to teach. This passive erasure was more complete than active persecution could have been because it happened without resistance, without anyone quite recognizing that something irreplaceable was being lost. By the 4th century CE, when the last cuneiform scribes died and the last priests performed final rituals in crumbling temples, the Anunnaki had been gone from human consciousness for centuries. Their names persisted only in old texts no one could read, in ruins no one could interpret, in vague references in classical literature that mentioned them as primitive superstitions of ancient Babylonians. The great cosmic council that had determined human fate, that had judged the dead, that had maintained universal order for 3,000 years of continuous worship, they vanished into silence so complete that when 19th century archaeologists began uncovering their texts and temples, it was like discovering an entirely lost world. And here's what haunts this story. No one recorded why. No final tablet explains the Anunnaki's departure. No prophet announced divine abandonment. No priest documented the moment of realization that the gods had stopped responding. Either the end was too gradual for anyone to perceive as ending, or those who recognized it lacked words or courage to record it, or perhaps the tablets recording such recognition simply haven't been found. We have texts spanning thousands of years of active worship and then sudden silence, as though a door closed that no one thought to document because they assumed it would open again, that the silence was temporary. That the gods would return when humans proved themselves worthy, but the gods didn't return. This silence extended until it became permanent, until memory of the Anunnaki survived only in clay buried beneath desert sand, waiting for a distant future that would excavate ruins, translate scripts, and try to understand beings who had once structured an entire civilization's understanding of cosmic order. Those tablets are still being read, translated, argued over. The Anunnaki's names are spoken again after 2,000 years of silence. Their myths are studied, their roles debated, their significance assessed by scholars who will never quite capture what they meant to people who believed in them absolutely. And so we're left with questions that may never be answered. Were the Anunnaki purely mythological, cultural constructs serving social and psychological functions? Or did something real, whether advanced individuals, lost civilization, or phenomena beyond current understanding, give rise to beliefs that outlasted whatever inspired them? Did they represent human projection of earthly hierarchies onto cosmic realms? Or did actual experience of something lead ancient people to develop the specific, consistent descriptions that appear across thousands of texts? We can document what ancient people believed. We can trace how those beliefs changed and ultimately disappeared. But the questions about what, if anything, those beliefs corresponded to in lived experience remain stubbornly open, neither proven nor disproven, haunting us across millennia just as they haunted the last priests who pressed final cuneiform signs into clay, knowing they were ending something that had seemed eternal. And so, As you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider what it means that we remember them at all. The Anunnaki rested in darkness for 2,000 years, their names unspoken, their stories untold, their cities buried beneath sand that held no memory of the prayers once offered there. And yet they waited, patient as stone, silent as the clay that preserved their voices, waiting for the moment when human curiosity would reach back across the centuries, when archaeologists would press shovels into ancient earth, when translators would recognize signs pressed by hands that had been dust for millennia. We found them again, we speak their names again. Enki, Enlil, the Council of Seven who determined fate. Whether they were gods or leaders, myths or memories, beings of flesh or beings of faith, they shaped the first civilization, structured the first cities, provided the framework through which humans first organized complex society, and reached toward the heavens with towers of mud brick and ambition. They mattered to the people who believed in them, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps mattering is its own form of existence, belief its own kind of reality. You're connected to them now, across 5,000 years, part of the same human story of wondering about what came before, of asking whether we were always alone or whether something once walked beside us, teaching and guiding and then withdrawing into silence that we're still trying to understand. The same stars they watched with such intensity still turn above you. The same questions that troubled ancient priests still trouble modern seekers. And the same darkness they trusted to hold their secrets now holds you gently as you let go of the story and let sleep arrive. The tablets rest in museum cases now, their cuneiform marks still holding mysteries we've only begun to answer. But they can wait. They've been waiting this long. And so can you let yourself rest now. Let the ancient world fade back into comfortable distance. Let the Anunnaki return to their long silence, while you drift into your own darkness, peaceful and complete. Sleep now. The gods, whether they were gods or something else entirely, are finished with their story for tonight. And yours is just beginning, in dreams where ancient and modern blur together, where all times touch, where perhaps, in some way we don't quite understand, the past is never truly lost but only sleeping, waiting to be remembered again when we're ready to listen. Rest now. Let go. Sleep.